Day 18 of the war, leadership assassinations, energy infrastructure burning, and the moment the global economy cannot afford to ignore. Welcome to Profit Pulse. Let me start today with something that is not dramatic language designed to get your attention. It is a simple statement of what is factually happening right now on day 18 of this conflict as you listen to this episode. Iran's top security official has been killed in an airstrike. More than 150 oil tankers are sitting outside the Strait of Hormuz, unable or unwilling to enter. Oil storage facilities at the Fujairah port in the United Arab Emirates are on fire. The Shah natural gas field, which powers desalination plants providing drinking water to millions of people, has been struck and suspended. Iraq's Majnoon oil field, one of the largest oil reservoirs in the world, has been attacked. Jet fuel prices have surged to the point where Scandinavian Airlines, according to Reuters reporting published today, is canceling approximately 1,000 flights in April. And Brent crude oil is trading at approximately $103 per barrel, roughly 50% above where it was when this conflict began, according to The Guardian's commodity market coverage published today. That is the picture, not a forecast, not a scenario analysis. That is what is actually happening today, on the 18th day of a war that has moved faster, spread wider, and struck deeper into the global economic system than most early assessments anticipated. This episode is going to take all of that, every development, every data point, every source, and build a complete, honest, analytically rigorous picture of what Day 18 means. Not just what happened, but why it happened, what it causes next, what the chain of consequences looks like from the oil field to the refinery to the gas pump to the grocery store to the central bank to the stock market, and finally to the specific decisions that a thoughtful, informed investor should be making right now. This video stands entirely on its own. Every piece of context you need is here. Every source is named, and the analysis is as free of bias as honest, careful thinking can make it. Understanding the economic consequences of a war does not require taking sides in it. It requires seeing it clearly. So let us see it clearly. Section 1. The killing of Ali Larijani. The full context and the full consequence according to The Guardian, reporting published today, the 17th of March 2026, Ali Larijani has been killed in an Israeli airstrike in Tehran. The Guardian's report, confirmed by Iran's National Security Council in a statement cited across multiple international news wires, identifies Larijani as the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, the body that coordinates Iran's highest-level military and strategic security decisions, chaired by the president, and composed of the most senior figures across Iran's military, intelligence, and political establishments. The strike also killed several members of Larijani's security team, according to The Guardian's reporting. Now let me give you the full context of who Larijani was, because the title alone, Secretary of a Security Council, does not convey the actual magnitude of what this killing represents inside the Iranian political system, and that magnitude matters enormously for understanding what happens next. Ali Larijani's career in the Iranian state, documented in detail by biographical sources including the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace's Iran Primer Project, spanned more than 3 decades. He had served as commander of the Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting, the state media organization, giving him deep influence over domestic information and narrative management. He had served as Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council in an earlier period, during which he was Iran's chief nuclear negotiator, engaging directly with European powers on the issues that eventually led to the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action nuclear agreement. He had served as Speaker of the Iranian Parliament for a full decade. He had been, in virtually every serious Western analytical assessment, one of the individuals within the Iranian system who understood the terms on which diplomatic accommodation with the West was possible, even if he was also a committed defender of Iranian strategic interests. The International Crisis Group, which publishes detailed analysis of conflict dynamics and diplomatic possibilities across fragile states, had previously identified Larijani as one of the figures whose institutional positioning and relationship history made him potentially valuable in any serious diplomatic off-ramp process. That assessment is not an endorsement of his political views or his policy record. It is an analytical observation about diplomatic institutional capacity. When you kill a figure with that profile, you do several things simultaneously. You remove from the Iranian state's decision-making apparatus someone with direct experience of negotiations with the West and direct understanding of what Western red lines and potential concessions look like. You impose a disruptive reorganization on the institutional structure of Iran's highest security decision-making body. You create intense domestic political pressure for a retaliatory response, because not responding to the killing of a figure of this seniority would be read inside Iran as extraordinary weakness. And you demonstrate to the Iranian leadership that no position, no title, no location inside Iranian territory provides physical safety from Israeli targeting. Each of those consequences connects to a market-relevant outcome. Let me trace each one. The removal of diplomatic institutional capacity moves the realistic timeline for any negotiated de-escalation further out. Negotiations require people who understand what the other side can accept. Every individual removed from the potential negotiating pool lengthens the runway to a diplomatic solution. Markets that are pricing some probability of a diplomatic resolution within a certain time frame must now revise that probability downward and push that time frame further into the future. Oil's fear premium, which is partly a function of expected conflict duration, rises accordingly. The internal reorganization of Iran's security decision-making creates a period of institutional uncertainty inside the Iranian government during which decision-making authority is unclear. Chains of command are being re-established, and the probability of a decision-making error, of a miscalculation, of an order that goes further than intended, of a retaliation that crosses a threshold that the previous leadership would have kept in mind, is elevated. Institutional uncertainty in a wartime adversary's command structure is not reassuring for conflict management. It is actually a source of escalation risk. The domestic political pressure for retaliation is perhaps the most immediate market-relevant consequence. The Iranian government, whatever its private calculations about the wisdom of further escalation, faces a domestic political environment in which failure to respond to the killing of the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council with significant force would be seen as capitulation. The institutional survival logic of the regime demands a response, and the scale of the likely response, given the seniority of the victim, is likely to exceed anything that has been seen so far in this conflict's retaliation pattern. That means another missile and drone wave at higher intensity. It means potentially a decision to escalate Hormuz interdiction from its current effective not total closure state towards something more complete and more aggressive. It means potentially the full activation of proxy forces in Lebanon, Iraq, and elsewhere that have so far been operating below their maximum capacity. And the demonstration of Israeli targeting reach inside Tehran, in the middle of Iran's capital, against the most heavily protected class of individuals in the country, sends a signal to the entire Iranian leadership that the military campaign is not limiting itself to military targets in the traditional sense. It is targeting the political and strategic leadership structure of the Iranian state itself. That signal changes the calculations of every surviving Iranian official about their own personal safety, their own institutional obligations, and the personal cost of a policy path that results in continued conflict. For oil markets, the confluence of these consequences is unambiguously upward in price pressure. Longer diplomatic timeline, higher retaliation probability, higher escalation risk from institutional disruption, and a strategic signal that this conflict has entered a phase of attempting to fundamentally reshape the Iranian political and military leadership landscape, which is the kind of objective that does not resolve in weeks. Section 2, Day 18 on the ground. What Al Jazeera's reporting tells U.S. about the campaign's character according to Al Jazeera's Day 18 conflict coverage, published today, the 17th of March 2026, United States and Israeli forces continue to conduct strikes against Iranian military infrastructure across multiple cities simultaneously. Al Jazeera's reporting identifies targets across Tehran, Tabriz, Shiraz, and Isfahan, four of Iran's most significant urban and industrial centers. Let me give you the geographic and strategic picture of what those four cities together represent, because the selection is not random, and the logic behind it tells you something important about the campaign's objectives and its likely duration. Tehran is Iran's capital and its political, financial, and administrative center. Striking Tehran means striking the command and control architecture of the Iranian state, the ministries, the security apparatus headquarters, the communications infrastructure, the military command facilities. Tehran strikes are aimed at degrading the state's capacity to coordinate and to function. Tabriz, in Iran's northwest Azerbaijan province, is one of Iran's largest industrial cities. According to the Iran Chamber of Society's economic data, Tabriz hosts significant components of Iran's defense manufacturing base, including facilities linked to missile component production. Striking Tabriz means attacking the supply chain that feeds Iran's ability to produce and deploy the missiles and drones it has been firing in large numbers throughout this conflict. Shiraz, in Fars province in southern Iran, is another major industrial and military center. It hosts radar installations, military airfields, and components of Iran's air defense system. Degrading Shiraz means degrading Iran's ability to defend its own airspace and to coordinate the kind of coordinated missile strike capability that requires sophisticated radar and command integration. Isfahan is perhaps the most strategically significant of the four cities in terms of its connection to Iran's nuclear program. Isfahan hosts the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center and associated facilities that have been subjects of international concern regarding uranium conversion and enrichment-related activities. Strikes on Isfahan facilities are strikes on the nuclear dimension of this conflict, the original stated casus belli for the entire campaign. Simultaneously striking all four of these cities is not a simple escalation of existing operations. It is a qualitatively different mode of warfare. It is a systematic, comprehensive, multi-node degradation campaign targeting the full spectrum of Iranian capabilities: political command, defense manufacturing, air defense, nuclear program, simultaneously, specifically to prevent any single element from compensating for damage to the others. Military strategists call this kind of operation a strategic air campaign. It is the mode of aerial warfare developed by the United States Air Force and documented in its own doctrine as the approach used in the opening phase of the 1991 Gulf War and the 2003 Iraq campaign. Sustained, precisely targeted strikes against an integrated set of command, control, communications, military-industrial, and leadership targets designed to collapse an adversary's ability to wage war as a coherent entity. The implications of this campaign character for conflict duration are specific and important. Strategic air campaigns, historically, require sustained operation over weeks to months to achieve their objectives against a target state with meaningful military depth. Iran has considerably more military-industrial depth than either Iraq in 1991 or in 2003. Its manufacturing facilities are more dispersed, more hardened, and more redundant than those of either Iraqi government at the time of those campaigns. According to analysis published by the RAND Corporation, the American research institution with the most extensive published record of open-source military analytical work, Iran's missile program, in particular, has been structured with redundancy and dispersal specifically as a lesson from the Iraqi experience of having its military capabilities concentrated, and thus more vulnerable to concentrated strikes. This means the strategic air campaign will take longer to achieve its operational objectives than comparable campaigns did in Iraq. It means the conflict is not ending in its third week. It is continuing into its fourth week, its fifth week, its sixth week, and potentially well beyond. For investors, the multi-city campaign character of the current operations is the most important indicator of duration available. It tells you that this conflict has been structured by both its planners and its conduct for an extended period of operations. Planning horizons, logistics, and resource allocation all reflect an assumption of sustained engagement. And when the military planner's own operational posture reflects an assumption of sustained engagement, the economic consequences of that conflict, oil price pressure, inflation transmission, trade disruption, should also be modeled against a sustained engagement timeline. Section 3. The Hormuz closure in 24-hour terms. What today's shipping data actually shows. The Wikipedia article on the 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis. A live updated reference page drawing from maritime tracking data, official statements, and news reporting confirms that more than 150 ships are currently positioned outside the strait rather than transiting it. CBS News, in its live updates coverage published today, reports that American officials acknowledge reopening the route may take weeks even after naval forces are positioned, because clearing naval mines and establishing credible deterrence for tanker escort operations involves logistical timelines that cannot be compressed below certain minimum durations regardless of political urgency. Let me translate these facts into the economic reality they produce on a day-by-day basis, because the accumulation matters more than any single day's numbers. The International Energy Agency, in its most recent oil market report, documented that approximately 21 million barrels per day of crude oil and petroleum products transited the Strait of Hormuz in the pre-conflict measurement period. That is not primarily tankers moving speculatively. That is scheduled, contracted delivery of crude oil to refineries, of liquefied natural gas to regasification terminals, of petroleum products to induce markets, all timed to the production cycles and inventory management systems of industrial economies that run on just-in-time principles. When those deliveries stop arriving on schedule, the first response of receiving facilities is to draw on their on-site storage, their tank farms, their strategic reserves, their pipeline inventories. According to the Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration, American commercial crude oil inventories at the time of the conflict's outbreak were running at approximately 440 million barrels, roughly 23 days of import coverage at pre-conflict import rates. That sounds like a meaningful buffer, but it is not a static cushion. It is being actively drawn down every day that the supply disruption continues, and it is not being replenished at normal rates because the tanker deliveries are not arriving. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the American government's emergency oil stockpile, stored in salt caverns along the Gulf of Mexico coast, holds approximately 350 million barrels according to the most recent Energy Information Administration status report. The current administration has the authority to authorize emergency releases from this reserve. A large coordinated release, combined with parallel International Energy Agency coordinated releases from allied nations' strategic reserves, can inject additional supply into the market. But strategic reserve releases are a finite and declining resource. Every barrel released from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve today is a barrel that is not available tomorrow. And the reserve has already been drawn down from its historical peak levels of over 700 million barrels following releases made in response to earlier supply disruptions. The arithmetic of supply disruption and reserve drawdown is not sustainable beyond a period of weeks to months. When commercial inventories fall to operationally critical levels, when refineries cannot maintain their feed rates because they literally do not have enough crude oil in their tanks to continue normal processing, the economic impact moves from elevated prices and consumer inconvenience into genuine scarcity. Genuine scarcity is a qualitatively different and far more severe economic condition than elevated prices. We are not at genuine scarcity today, but the trajectory toward it is real and measurable, and the timeline to its arrival is being calculated in real time by the most sophisticated commodity analysts at every major investment bank and energy research firm. According to Wood Mackenzie analysis cited in Bloomberg's energy coverage, at current disruption levels sustained for 60 days, several Asian refining centers would face operationally critical inventory situations. For investors, this timeline calculation, not the current price, but the trajectory toward operationally critical conditions, is the most important data point for understanding the potential severity of the economic damage. A supply disruption that is resolved before inventories reach critical levels produces a price spike and a recovery. A supply disruption that runs long enough to produce genuine scarcity produces something fundamentally different: rationing, production curtailments, supply chain seizures, and economic disruption that takes much longer to reverse. Section 4. The Fujairah Attack in Forensic Detail. Why this specific target matters more than the headlines convey, according to the Sunday Guardian's reporting on the Fujairah attack, published in its detailed analysis of the UAE oil hub's strategic significance. Drone strikes have hit oil storage facilities at Fujairah port, causing fires that required significant emergency response and disrupting operations at one of the world's most strategically important maritime energy logistics centers. Let me tell you exactly what Fujairah port is, in numbers and in function, because the strategic significance of attacking this specific location cannot be overstated. Fujairah port, according to the Fujairah Oil Industry Zone's own published operational statistics, is the second largest bunkering port in the world, second only to Singapore in total volume of marine fuel delivered to passing vessels. It handles approximately 8 million tons of marine fuel per year, according to FOI's data. It holds more than 10 million barrels of oil storage capacity across the tank farms and petroleum handling facilities in and around the port. And crucially, the characteristic that makes it most strategically significant in the context of this conflict: it sits on the Gulf of Oman coast, outside the Strait of Hormuz, giving it direct access to the Indian Ocean without requiring any vessel to transit the contested waterway. The Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, the ADCOP pipeline, operated by the International Petroleum Investment Company, which is the UAE's sovereign investment arm for energy assets, runs approximately 370 kilometers from the Habshan oil processing facility in Abu Dhabi's interior directly to Ruwais and then to the coast at Fujairah, bypassing the Strait of Hormuz entirely. It has a nameplate capacity of approximately 1.5 million barrels per day, according to the International Petroleum Investment Company's infrastructure disclosures. This pipeline was specifically built and specifically sized as a Hormuz contingency plan. It was the UAE's response to exactly the scenario currently unfolding, the scenario in which the Strait of Hormuz becomes too dangerous or too disrupted for normal commercial shipping. The pipeline means that even if the strait closes completely, UAE crude can still reach the global market through Fujairah. Or rather, it meant that, until Fujairah itself became a target. When Iranian-linked drones struck the oil storage facilities at Fujairah, they were not attacking a peripheral target. They were attacking the contingency plan. They were demonstrating, deliberately, specifically, and with evident strategic planning, that the alternative route is within operational reach and is being treated as a valid military target. The message is precise: there is no safe alternative. Every route is contested. Every hub is a potential target. The market implication of this demonstration is specific and measurable. Before the Fujairah attacks, oil market models that were pricing in Hormuz disruption scenarios were including Fujairah capacity as a partial supply offset, a source of export continuity that would limit the severity of the supply shock even in a significant Hormuz disruption scenario. Those models must now be revised to remove that offset, because the offset itself has been demonstrated to be vulnerable. Oil market models that remove the Fujairah offset from their Hormuz disruption scenarios produce higher price estimates. Bank of America and Standard Chartered, according to Reuters reporting published today, have both raised their Brent crude forecasts in direct response to exactly this logic. The Fujairah attack also has a secondary dimension that is rarely discussed in commodity market coverage, but that is significant for the broader regional economic picture. The bunkering operations at Fujairah, the marine fuel deliveries to passing vessels, are not just a business for the UAE. They are a logistical service for the entire global shipping network. When vessels transiting from Asia toward European or American markets stop in Fujairah to take on fuel, they are depending on Fujairah's operational status as part of their own voyage planning. Disrupting Fujairah operations cascades through the fuel supply chains of vessels that have nothing to do with Middle Eastern oil exports. Global shipping logistics becomes more complicated and more expensive even for vessels on routes that never come near the conflict zone. Section 5. The Shah gas field attack. The water crisis nobody is reporting. Reuters, in its reporting from the 16th of March 2026, confirmed that operations at the UAE's Shah gas field have been suspended following a drone attack. The report, published on Reuters' Business and Energy Desk, identifies Shah as a major natural gas production asset whose suspension creates supply stress for UAE domestic energy systems. I want to go deeper on Shah than most coverage has gone, because the full implications of this attack include a dimension that is almost entirely absent from financial media coverage, and that represents one of the most severe humanitarian and economic risks emerging from the infrastructure targeting campaign. The Shah sour gas development processes what is called sour gas, natural gas with high concentrations of hydrogen sulfide that requires extensive processing before it can be used. According to Abu Dhabi National Energy Company, TAQA, which is the operator of the Shah field alongside Occidental Petroleum, Shah produces approximately 1 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day after processing. That processed gas is sold into the UAE's domestic gas grid, where it feeds power generation facilities, industrial consumers, and critically, desalination plants. The UAE is one of the most water-scarce nations on Earth. According to the World Resources Institute's Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas, the UAE ranks among the highest-risk nations globally for water stress, meaning the ratio of water demand to available renewable freshwater supply is extremely high. The UAE's response to this scarcity has been to build one of the most extensive desalination systems in the world. According to the International Desalination Association, the UAE operates desalination plants with a combined capacity of approximately 2 billion gallons of fresh water production per day, making desalination the UAE's primary source of drinking water. Desalination is an energy-intensive process. The multi-stage flash distillation and reverse osmosis plants that dominate UAE desalination capacity require large and consistent energy inputs to operate. That energy, in the UAE's case, comes primarily from natural gas, and a significant portion of that natural gas comes from the Shah field. When you suspend Shah operations, you are not just disrupting natural gas supply to industrial users who can potentially reduce their consumption. You are threatening the energy supply to the facilities that produce the water that the UAE's population drinks. The humanitarian and social stability implications of a water supply disruption, even a partial and temporary one, in a country with essentially no alternative water sources, are severe in ways that go well beyond ordinary economic analysis. For investors, the Shah attack illustrates the specific and concerning character of the infrastructure targeting campaign. It is not limiting itself to military or even petroleum production targets. It is targeting the integrated infrastructure on which modern Gulf state societies depend. Attacks on that integrated infrastructure, power, water, gas, oil, create cascading failures that are harder to repair quickly than simple production disruptions, that have more severe humanitarian consequences, and that generate more intense domestic and international political pressure on the governments of the affected states. More intense political pressure on Gulf governments means more urgency in their own policy responses. And Gulf government policy responses, whether toward the United States for protection, toward Iran in some kind of accommodation, or toward their own military preparation, are among the most consequential variables in determining whether this conflict stays regional or expands further. Section 6. The Majnoon oil field and what attacking Iraq's largest reservoir means for OPEC. The Majnoon oil field in southern Iraq, struck in recent operations according to The Guardian's energy infrastructure attack coverage, is not simply one oil field among many. It is one of the largest conventional oil reservoirs in the world, with recoverable reserves estimated at approximately 38 billion barrels by Iraq's own Ministry of Oil, and confirmed in assessments published by the United States Energy Information Administration. To put 38 billion barrels in perspective, the entire proven oil reserve of the United States, the country that has revolutionized global oil supply through the shale oil revolution, is estimated by the EIA at approximately 38 billion barrels. Majnoon alone, in southern Iraq, holds the equivalent of the entire American proven reserve base in a single field. Majnoon is operated by a joint venture that includes Shell, one of the world's largest international oil companies, headquartered in the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, according to the Iraqi Ministry of Oil's published concession agreements. Shell's involvement means that attacks on Majnoon are attacks on assets in which one of the world's most prominent Western energy companies has major capital invested. The financial and operational implications for Shell are direct and immediate. Iraq's total oil production, according to the most recent OPEC monthly oil market report published by the organization's Vienna Secretariat, runs at approximately 4 million barrels per day. That makes Iraq the second largest OPEC producer after Saudi Arabia. Iraq's oil revenues, according to Iraq's Ministry of Finance budget documentation, fund approximately 90% of the Iraqi government's budget. Without oil revenues, the Iraqi state cannot pay salaries, maintain services, service its debts, or sustain the political arrangements that give it its current fragile stability. An attack on Majnoon is therefore not just a supply disruption event. It is an attack on the fiscal foundation of the Iraqi state itself. It creates pressure on the Iraqi government to respond. But the Iraqi government is caught in an extraordinarily difficult position between its relationships with Iran and its relationships with the United States, as we discussed in the previous episode. The pressure from a major oil production disruption adds to the already intense political stress on Baghdad without providing a clear policy response that would satisfy all of its competing relationships. For global oil supply, the Majnoon disruption adds to the cumulative supply shock in a market that was already struggling to absorb the Hormuz closure and the other infrastructure attacks. Every additional million barrels per day of disrupted supply tightens the global balance further, reduces the available buffer in commercial inventories faster, and pulls forward the timeline at which the global oil market transitions from price shock to genuine scarcity. Section 7. SAS cancels 1,000 flights. The real economy impact is starting to show. Reuters, in reporting published today, the 17th of March 2026, confirms that Scandinavian Airlines, SAS, is canceling approximately 1,000 flights in April due to high fuel prices directly linked to the conflict-driven oil price surge. This is a landmark development in the economic transmission of this conflict, and it deserves careful analysis beyond the immediate headline number. SAS is a mid-sized European carrier operating primarily across Scandinavia and connecting European routes. It is not one of the largest airlines in the world. That distinction belongs to carriers like Delta, American, United, Lufthansa, and Ryanair. But the significance of SAS's announcement is not its scale. It is its signal value. SAS has a fleet management, fuel hedging, and operational planning team that spends its professional lives modeling the economics of airline operations under different fuel cost scenarios. When SAS's management team, people who do nothing but think about this problem, concludes that the fuel cost environment has become severe enough that canceling 1,000 flights is better economics than operating them, they are telling you something precise about where jet fuel prices are relative to ticket pricing power and operational costs. Airlines can absorb fuel cost increases in several ways. They can pass them through to passengers in higher ticket prices. They can reduce their fuel consumption through route optimization, lower cruising altitudes, and reduced auxiliary power use. They can draw on existing fuel hedging contracts, forward purchases of jet fuel at prearranged prices, to buffer their exposure to spot market prices. And they can simply accept lower margins in the short term, betting that fuel prices will normalize before the balance sheet damage becomes critical. SAS's decision to cancel 1,000 flights means that for this carrier, the fuel cost increase has exceeded the capacity of all of those mitigation strategies simultaneously. Ticket prices cannot absorb the full increase because demand is elastic. At some price point, passengers stop buying tickets. The hedging contracts are either exhausted or were written at prices that are too far below the current spot market to be effective buffers. And the margin sacrifice option is not available because SAS was already operating with thin margins before this conflict began, as most European carriers do in the highly competitive short-haul European aviation market. The cause and effect chain from oil price to SAS flight cancellations is direct and traceable. But it does not stop with SAS. SAS is the first major carrier to make a formal large-scale operational cutback announcement, but it will not be the last. According to the International Air Transport Association, the global airline industry trade body, which publishes regular industry financial assessments, the airline industry as a whole faces an additional cost burden estimated in the tens of billions of dollars if oil prices remain at current levels through the end of the year. That burden will manifest across the industry in the same ways it is manifesting at SAS. Flight cancellations, route reductions, capacity cuts, and in the worst cases for the most financially vulnerable carriers, existential balance sheet stress. The market implications for airline stocks are straightforward. The revenue impact of flight cancellations is immediate and direct. A canceled flight generates no revenue. The cost impact is partially mitigated. A canceled flight saves fuel, but the fixed costs of crew availability, aircraft maintenance, slot fees, and overhead continue regardless. The net effect on airline profitability is severely negative. But the broader market implication of airline capacity cuts goes beyond the airline sector itself. When airlines cut capacity, they reduce the connectivity of the global economy. Business travel that cannot happen delays deals, reduces economic activity, and slows the kind of in-person relationship building that generates productive business outcomes. Tourism that cannot happen reduces revenue for hospitality sectors, for local services, for retail in destination cities. The multiplier effect of airline capacity reduction on broader economic activity is real, if harder to measure precisely than the direct airline profitability impact. Section 8, 2,000 attacks across the Gulf. What the volume tells you about strategy Reuters reporting, confirmed by multiple regional and international sources, documents that more than 2,000 drone and missile attacks have occurred across the broader Gulf region since the conflict began. These attacks have targeted United States military bases, ports, airports, oil facilities, and commercial buildings across the UAE, Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. 2,000 attacks in 18 days. That is an average of more than 111 attacks per day, every day since this conflict began. That number tells you something important about the strategic character of Iran's military campaign that the daily coverage of individual incidents does not convey. 111 attacks per day is not a pattern of targeted, specific retaliation. It is a sustained operational tempo that requires planning, logistics, production, and command coordination at a level that cannot be improvised or maintained through emotional reaction to specific events. An attack rate of that volume requires a systematic drone and missile production and deployment pipeline that was built, stocked, and positioned before the conflict began. It requires distributed launch sites across the region, operated by Iran's own forces and by proxy forces under Iranian direction, that have been maintained in operational readiness for exactly this kind of sustained campaign. And it requires a command structure that can coordinate those distributed launch operations across multiple countries, target types, and operational objectives simultaneously. According to analysis published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Washington-based defense and security think tank, Iran has been building and positioning this distributed launch capability for years, specifically in anticipation of a potential conflict with the United States and Israel. The Houthi drone campaign against shipping in the Red Sea, which preceded this conflict, was one expression of that capability. The militia network in Iraq, which has been attacking American bases, is another. The direct Iranian military operations against Israel and Gulf states are the third. All of these are components of a single, integrated operational architecture that was designed for exactly the kind of multi-front, sustained tempo campaign currently being conducted. Understanding this operational architecture has a specific investor implication that goes beyond simply noting that the attacks are happening. It tells you that the capability being deployed is not being improvised or rapidly depleted. It was built for duration. The missile production facilities in Tabriz and Shiraz, which Israeli strikes are attempting to degrade, are the supply chain for this capability. Degrading them reduces the future replenishment rate for the stockpiles being consumed. But the existing distributed stockpile, positioned across multiple countries in dispersed caches, represents months of operational capacity at current usage rates even without replenishment, according to open-source military capability assessments. For investors, this operational architecture analysis produces a simple conclusion. The 2000 ATAC number tells you that the capability sustaining this conflict was built for a multi-month campaign. The timeline of the conflict is therefore not being driven by the rapid depletion of a limited missile stockpile. It is being driven by political and strategic decisions, by diplomatic possibilities, by the willingness of each side to absorb damage. And those decision-driven timelines are inherently harder to predict and typically longer than capability-to-ability timelines. Plan for a longer conflict than your base case currently assumes. Section 9, Trump calls for allies to help reopen Hormuz. The coalition effort and its market significance, according to reporting from the Beaumont Enterprise, citing updates from the White House and State Department, President Trump has formally called on allied nations to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz and secure shipping routes through the Persian Gulf. The call for allied participation in a naval coalition to escort tankers and secure the shipping lane is the most significant diplomatic and military organizational development of the current phase of the conflict from a market perspective. Let me explain precisely why this coalition effort matters so much for financial markets, and why its success or failure over the next 2 to 3 weeks will likely be the single most important market-moving development available. The Hormuz supply disruption is the primary transmission mechanism through which this military conflict becomes economic crisis. The oil price surge, the inflation pressure, the central bank policy uncertainty, the equity market stress, all of these flow primarily from the fact that 20% of global oil supply is not moving as it should. If that flow is restored, even partially, the most acute phase of the economic disruption begins resolving. If it is not restored, the disruption compounds daily toward the operationally critical inventory situations we discussed earlier. A naval coalition capable of providing credible escort protection for commercial tankers is the most direct available tool for restoring that flow. It is not a solution to the underlying conflict. The missiles and airstrikes continue regardless of what happens at Hormuz. But it is a potential solution to the specific bottleneck that is translating military conflict into economic crisis. The challenges facing the coalition effort are real and specific. According to former United States Navy officers cited in defense policy publications including War on the Rocks and the Proceedings of the United States Naval Institute, assembling a coalition capable of credibly escorting very large crude carriers through the strait requires a level of naval coordination, rules of engagement clarity, and participating nation commitment that takes weeks to establish properly. It is not a matter of announcing that Allied ships will escort tankers. It is a matter of establishing who bears what risk, under what legal authority, with what escalation rules, and with what chain of command when an Iranian vessel challenges an escorted convoy. Additionally, the commercial shipping community's willingness to send their vessels through the strait, even with naval escorts, is not guaranteed by the existence of those escorts. Shipping company risk assessments, crew union safety requirements, and insurance market conditions all need to move in a positive direction simultaneously for commercial transit to resume. According to maritime legal and insurance experts cited in Lloyd's list ongoing coverage, war risk insurance premiums need to return to commercially viable levels, which likely requires not just the announcement of a naval coalition, but the demonstrated operational success of that coalition in protecting vessels through the strait without incident. The realistic timeline for a fully functional naval coalition, from Trump's public call for Allied participation to the first commercially insured, crew-accepted tanker convoy successfully transiting the strait with naval escort, is measured in weeks, not days. CBS News reporting today specifically quotes American officials acknowledging that weeks are the realistic timeline even under the most favorable circumstances. But here is the crucial market point about this timeline. Markets do not wait for operational success to price in its probability. Markets price in the expectation of success as soon as credible signals emerge. When specific allied nations begin publicly committing naval vessels to the coalition, when rules of engagement are announced, when the first escort operation is scheduled, market participants will begin reducing the oil risk premium, not all the way to pre-conflict levels, but meaningfully. The trajectory toward Hormuz reopening, if credible, is itself a price-moving catalyst even before the first tanker successfully transits. Watch for the following specific signals in the coalition coverage as leading indicators of market movement. First, named nation commitments, specific allies publicly committing specific naval assets. Second, rules of engagement announcements, which indicate that the political and legal architecture of the coalition is being built, not just discussed. Third, shipping company statements about willingness to resume transit with escort, which indicate that the commercial community is beginning to assess the coalition as potentially viable. And fourth, insurance market movements. If war risk premiums begin declining even modestly, it is a signal that professional risk assessors with their own money at stake are beginning to price in improved Hormuz security. Section 10, Fuel shortages in Asia. The ripple is becoming a wave. According to The Guardian's reporting on global supply chain impacts, shortages of refined fuel products, diesel and jet fuel specifically, are beginning to appear in parts of Asia. Some governments in the region are implementing fuel-saving measures in anticipation of continued supply disruption. This development, from price spike to physical shortage, is the most significant economic escalation signal in the current data. And it requires careful explanation because the mechanism is not simply about oil prices. It is about the specific geography of refining capacity and refined product distribution that makes Asian markets particularly vulnerable to exactly the kind of disruption this conflict has created. The global oil market distinguishes between crude oil, unrefined petroleum extracted from the ground, and refined products. The diesel, gasoline, jet fuel, heating oil, and chemical feedstocks that crude oil is processed into. Most crude oil is exported in its raw form from producing regions and refined closer to end markets. The major refining centers for Asian consumption are located in South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, India, and China itself. These refineries depend on crude oil deliveries that historically came primarily through the Strait of Hormuz. When those deliveries are disrupted, the refineries process at reduced rates. When refineries process at reduced rates, they produce less diesel, less jet fuel, less gasoline, less of everything. And when the production of refined products falls below the rate of consumption of those products, physical shortages develop, not just price increases, but actual insufficient availability of the product. The specific products appearing in shortage in Asian markets, diesel and jet fuel, are the most economically critical refined petroleum products after gasoline. Diesel powers the trucks that move goods, the ships that move cargo, the buses and trains that move people, and the generators that provide backup power to critical facilities. Jet fuel powers commercial aviation, the passenger and cargo flights that connect the global economy. When either of these products is in physical shortage, the economic damage is immediate, widespread, and difficult to substitute around. According to the Asian Development Bank's Energy Security Analysis, published in its Asian Development Outlook report, the Asian region collectively holds strategic petroleum reserves that are, on average, significantly smaller as a proportion of consumption than the reserves held by International Energy Agency member nations in Europe and North America. Japan, as an IEA member, maintains the most robust strategic reserve system in Asia. South Korea has improved its reserve capacity significantly in recent years. But India, Southeast Asian nations, and many of the smaller economies in the region have more limited strategic cushion. The emergence of fuel shortages in Asian markets on day 18 of the conflict, before the supply disruption has even fully peaked, suggests that the reserve buffers for these nations are thinner than the situation requires. If the conflict continues at its current intensity for another 2 to 4 weeks, the shortage signals currently appearing in Asia will intensify and spread. For investors with exposure to Asian equity markets, this is the most important economic data point to track. Physical fuel shortages in Asia translate into industrial production slowdowns, transportation cost spikes that are above and beyond the general price increases already visible, and economic growth deceleration that is more severe than the baseline supply shock scenarios predicted. The Asian Development Bank and the International Monetary Fund's Asia-Pacific desk will be revising their growth forecasts downward in their next publication cycles, and those revisions will be market-moving for Asian equity indices. Section 11. The Diplomatic Landscape on Day 18. Honest assessment of where talks stand. Let me give you the most honest and most complete picture available of the diplomatic landscape on Day 18. Because understanding what is and is not happening in terms of conflict resolution is essential for any realistic investor time horizon assessment. What is happening diplomatically is less than the headlines suggest and more than nothing. Qatar, the Gulf state that has historically served as a communication channel between the United States and Iran, having hosted indirect nuclear talks on multiple occasions, and maintaining a functioning embassy relationship with Tehran, while also hosting the largest American airbase in the Middle East region at Al Udeid, is, according to diplomatic reporting from Reuters, engaged in back-channel communication efforts. Qatar's foreign minister has made several international trips since the conflict began, visiting capitals with influence over the different parties. The specific content of those conversations is not public, as is appropriate for genuine back-channel diplomacy. Oman, which brokered the secret preliminary talks that led to the 2013 Geneva Framework, and then the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action Nuclear Agreement, and which has the unique distinction of maintaining diplomatic relations with both the United States and Iran, even through periods of maximum bilateral tension, is similarly reported to be playing a behind-the-scenes communication role. Oman's Sultan Haytham bin Tariq Al Said has met with officials from multiple parties since the conflict began, according to Omani state media and international diplomatic reporting. China's engagement, which we discussed in the previous episode, has taken on a more concrete character in the most recent days. Chinese foreign minister statements have moved from generic calls for dialogue toward language that, according to diplomatic analysts cited by the Financial Times, suggests China is offering to serve as a more active facilitation role, not just a commentator calling for restraint. But here is the honest constraint on all of these diplomatic efforts that investors need to understand clearly. Diplomatic engagement produces ceasefire or de-escalation outcomes when 3 conditions are met simultaneously. The parties must be willing to talk. They must be willing to accept the other side's minimum conditions for a pause. And the facilitator must have sufficient credibility with and leverage over both sides to bridge the gap between those minimum conditions. On day 18, all 3 conditions face serious obstacles. Iran's willingness to talk has been complicated by the killing of Larijani, a figure who had direct diplomatic experience with Western interlocutors, and by the domestic political imperative to demonstrate strength following high-profile leadership losses. Talking within days of Larijani's assassination would be read domestically as capitulation under pressure. The gap between the parties' minimum conditions remains very wide. Iran's minimum condition for any pause involves assurances about the future of its security and regional position that the United States and Israel are not currently prepared to offer. The United States and Israel's minimum conditions for any pause involve Iran accepting constraints on its nuclear program and its regional proxy activities that Iran is not currently prepared to accept. That gap does not close in days, it closes over weeks of careful facilitation. And China's credibility as a facilitator, while real and growing, has limits. China has economic leverage over Iran through its energy purchasing decisions. It is Iran's largest oil customer, and threatening to reduce those purchases would be a powerful pressure tool. But China is reluctant to use that leverage in ways that damage its relationship with Iran, which it sees as a long-term strategic partner in the broader competition with American global influence. China will facilitate if facilitation is available at acceptable cost. It will not pay high costs to impose a solution. The realistic diplomatic timeline against these constraints is weeks to months before any serious preliminary framework for a ceasefire is in place, and months to a year or more before a durable resolution is reached. That is not pessimism. It is the historical baseline for conflicts of comparable complexity and intensity. The Iran-Iraq War, for reference, lasted 8 years. The nuclear negotiations that produced the 2015 deal took 12 years of intermittent engagement from their inception in 2003. The current conflict involves dimensions of both. For investors, the diplomatic timeline assessment translates directly into a positioning duration conclusion. If resolution is months away, the structural investment themes, energy, defense, gold, domestic resilience, need to be held for months, not traded on weekly news flow. Patience is not just a virtue in this environment. It is the specific operational requirement of the correctly positioned portfolio. Section 12. The Federal Reserve is trapped. Monetary policy on day 18. The Federal Reserve, the institution whose interest rate decisions affect the discount rate applied to every financial asset denominated in dollars, and through dollar dominance, nearly every financial asset on Earth, is operating in a policy environment that has become significantly more constrained since this conflict began. Let me give you the precise current state of the monetary policy picture, with the specific data points that define it. Before the conflict began, according to federal funds futures market pricing tracked by the CME Group's FedWatch tool, the most widely used real-time aggregator of market expectations for Federal Reserve policy, market participants were pricing in approximately 3 interest rate cuts of 25 basis points each during the calendar year 2026. The first cut was expected in the May or June Federal Open Market Committee meeting. The reasoning was straightforward. Inflation had been declining toward the Federal Reserve's 2% target, economic growth was slowing but not contracting, and the Fed had signaled openness to easing as the inflation fight appeared to be succeeding. That pricing has changed materially since the conflict began. According to current CME FedWatch data, the probability of a May rate cut has declined to very low levels. The expected timing of the first cut has moved to the second half of the year at the earliest, and scenarios involving no cuts at all in 2026 are now being assigned meaningful probability weight. The reason for this repricing is the inflation arithmetic of 50% higher oil prices, which we have traced in detail across this series. Let me give you the specific numbers. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco published research, available on their public research portal, analyzing the historical relationship between oil price increases and core consumer price inflation. Their analysis, covering multiple oil price episodes since 1973, finds that a 10% increase in oil prices typically adds approximately 0.2 to 0.3 percentage points to core consumer price index inflation over the following 12 months, with the peak effect appearing around 6 to 9 months after the price increase. At 50% higher oil prices, which is where we are today, that mathematical relationship implies approximately 1 to 1.5 percentage points of additional inflation pressure flowing into the consumer price index over the next 6 to 9 months. Against the Federal Reserve's 2% inflation target, adding 1 to 1.5 percentage points means inflation staying significantly above target for an extended period, without any change in the Fed's current interest rate stance. To hit its 2% inflation target in this environment, the Fed would need to maintain rates at current levels or even raise them to offset the inflationary impulse from energy prices. But maintaining current rates at a time when the economy is already slowing from the energy cost shock risks pushing growth into contraction, into the technical recession that every government wants to avoid declaring. This is the policy trap. The Fed has no good option. Cut rates and inflation stays elevated or accelerates. Hold rates and risk recession. Raise rates and risk a more severe recession while oil-driven inflation continues regardless. Because the standard interest rate transmission mechanism, slowing credit growth to reduce spending, does not address a supply shock where prices are rising because of physical unavailability rather than excess demand. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell's most recent public statements, parsed carefully by economists and analysts at every major institution, have been notable for their acknowledgement of heightened uncertainty without clear directional guidance. According to Bloomberg's coverage of his most recent remarks to the Economic Club of Washington, Powell used language that emphasized the unusual combination of risks facing the committee: simultaneously inflation above target, slowing growth, and supply-side disruption, in ways that implicitly acknowledged the difficulty of the current environment without committing to a specific response. That careful, non-committal language is itself market-moving. When the Federal Reserve is uncertain, markets price in a higher uncertainty premium. And higher uncertainty premiums reduce equity valuations across the board, because investors require higher expected returns to justify holding risky assets in an environment where central bank policy, normally a predictable stabilizing force, is itself uncertain. For investors, the Fed's trapped position is one of the most powerful reasons to maintain meaningful defensive positioning in the current environment. The tailwind from declining rates that was supposed to support equity valuations in 2026 has been significantly weakened, possibly eliminated. Growth assets that were priced on the assumption of monetary easing face a more challenging valuation environment than their current prices reflect. Section 13, the Oman Dimension. A new front and a diplomatic channel simultaneously. Wikipedia's article on the 2026 Iranian strikes on Oman. A live updated reference drawing from regional and international news sources, documents that Iran has conducted strikes on targets in Oman, adding another country to the geographic map of active conflict. Oman occupies a uniquely sensitive position in this conflict that makes its involvement both especially alarming and especially significant for diplomatic prospects. Let me explain both dimensions. The alarming dimension first. Oman shares the Strait of Hormuz with Iran. The southern coast of the strait is Omani territory. The Musandam Peninsula, the most northerly part of Oman, juts into the Gulf from the south, flanking the strait's shipping lanes on one side while Iran flanks it from the north. Iranian military operations near or in Oman directly affects the strait's security architecture in ways that attacks on other Gulf states do not. Oman's territorial waters and Oman's airspace are part of the physical corridor through which shipping would need to transit even in an escorted convoy arrangement. Attacks on Oman therefore complicate the naval coalition that the United States is attempting to assemble. An escort operation through the strait requires operating through waters that are now themselves subject to Iranian attack. That raises the operational risk for coalition naval vessels, and for the commercial tankers, they would be escorting to levels that complicate the coalition's viability. But here is the simultaneously significant diplomatic dimension. Oman has historically maintained a uniquely functional relationship with Iran that no other Gulf state has replicated. Oman's Sultan, Sultan Haytham bin Tariq Al Said, who succeeded Sultan Qaboos following his death in 2020, has continued the tradition of Omani neutrality and constructive engagement with all parties that made Oman the backchannel host for the secret talks that produced the 2015 nuclear deal. Oman's ability to serve as a communication channel between the United States and Iran depends on Iran's willingness to treat Oman as a neutral party rather than as a member of the opposing coalition. Iranian strikes on Omani territory threaten to destroy exactly the diplomatic architecture that Oman represents. If Iran is striking Oman, it is either choosing to sacrifice the diplomatic channel that Oman provides, suggesting it sees no value in that channel at this moment, or it is conducting operations that it assesses as targeting American military assets in Oman without intending to destroy the bilateral Iran-Oman relationship, which is a very fine line to walk militarily and diplomatically. For investors trying to assess diplomatic prospects, Oman's status is a key indicator. If Omani officials continue their diplomatic engagement, if the Omani Foreign Ministry continues meeting with counterparts from both sides, if Oman does not formally sever its exceptional relationship with Iran, then the backchannel architecture remains intact and can be activated if and when political conditions allow. If Omani officials begin treating Iran as a belligerent enemy rather than a difficult partner, if Oman formally joins the coalition against Iran, then the most credible existing diplomatic channel has been closed, and the timeline to any negotiated outcome extends significantly. Section 14. What the energy markets are pricing and what they are not yet pricing. Let me give you the most direct and most useful analysis of where energy market pricing stands today and what that implies for the likely direction of future price movement. Brent crude is at approximately $103 per barrel, according to The Guardian's commodity coverage published today. That is 50% above pre-conflict levels of around $70. The question that matters for investors is whether $103 represents correct pricing of the current situation, underpricing of the risks that exist, or overpricing due to excessive fear. My assessment, based on the cumulative evidence across this episode and the preceding episodes of this series, is that current pricing is more likely to be underpricing than overpricing. Let me give you the specific reasons. Current pricing appears to be incorporating the following supply disruption scenario: significant Hormuz disruption, some infrastructure attacks, elevated military risk, but ultimately a situation that resolves within a few months without escalating to the catastrophic regional war scenario. This is essentially the controlled conflict scenario we have been discussing throughout this series: uncomfortable, economically damaging, but manageable. But the facts developed in today's episode suggest that the probability of the controlled conflict scenario has declined since it was originally assessed. The Larijani assassination increases retaliation probability and reduces diplomatic pathway probability. The Fujairah attack eliminates the contingency supply route that the market had been partially relying on as a buffer. The simultaneous multi-city airstrike campaign across Tehran, Tabriz, Shiraz, and Isfahan signals a prolonged strategic campaign, not a limited operation. The physical fuel shortages appearing in Asian markets suggest the supply disruption is already more severe than a simple price signal conveys. And the consolidation of power, per Washington Post intelligence reporting, reduces the near-term probability of a pragmatic Iranian decision to de-escalate. Each of these facts moves probability mass from the controlled conflict scenario toward either the prolonged strategic conflict scenario or the major escalation scenario. And both of those scenarios are associated with higher oil prices than current levels. The counterargument to this underpricing analysis is the naval coalition effort. If the United States successfully assembles a credible escort coalition and begins restoring Hormuz tanker traffic within the next 2 to 3 weeks, the supply disruption would be partially reversed, and the fear premium would dissipate. That would be a genuine market-moving positive catalyst that current analysis may be underweighting. Honest uncertainty about the coalition effort's success probability is the primary reason not to be excessively confident in any single price forecast. The range of realistic outcomes from current conditions is wide. Oil at 130 or higher if escalation continues without coalition success. Oil at 80 to 90 if the coalition effort succeeds and diplomatic signals emerge. Oil at 60 or lower if a full ceasefire is reached quickly, an outcome currently judged by most analysts as very low probability. Position for the range, not for single point. Section 15. Specific investor actions. The 8 decisions that matter right now. Let me close the analytical portion of this episode with the specific, concrete investor actions that the Day 18 picture supports. I am going to be direct, detailed, and specific, while maintaining the honest caveat that this is not personalized financial advice, and your specific situation requires your own judgment and professional consultation. The first action is energy sector position review. If you have energy sector exposure through large integrated oil majors, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, Total Energies, BP, evaluate whether your position size is appropriate for a scenario where oil stays above $100 for 6 to 12 months. At these price levels, the cash generation of the major integrated oil companies is extraordinary. ExxonMobil's most recent earnings call guidance, according to its official investor relations communications filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission, showed that the company's free cash flow generation is highly sensitive to oil price levels, with each $10 per barrel increase in oil adding approximately $2.5 billion annually to free cash flow. At $103 oil versus $70 oil, a $33 increase. That represents approximately $8 billion in additional annual free cash flow. That cash goes to dividends, share buybacks, and balance sheet strengthening. It is directly shareholder value. Energy infrastructure companies, pipeline operators, storage facility operators, liquefied natural gas terminal operators, are a related but distinct exposure worth considering. These companies earn fee-based revenues that are less directly linked to commodity prices, but that benefit from the increased demand for domestic energy infrastructure as global supply chains are disrupted. The Illyrian MLP Infrastructure Index tracks the major American energy infrastructure master limited partnerships and provides a relevant benchmark for this category. The second action is a defense sector position precision assessment. Not all defense companies benefit equally from this conflict. The most directly relevant companies are those manufacturing the specific capability types being consumed and in demand. Raytheon Technologies, which makes the Patriot and the NASAMS air defense systems, the AI Mont-20 air-to-air missile, and the Stormbreaker precision guided munition, among many others, is among the most directly positioned. Lockheed Martin, manufacturer of THAAD air defense systems, the F-35 and the JASSM cruise missile family, is similarly positioned. Northrop Grumman, which produces the B-21 Raider stealth bomber currently relevant for future strategic options, the Global Hawk unmanned surveillance aircraft, and key electronic warfare systems, is a third major exposure worth evaluating. L3Harris Technologies, which specializes in electronic warfare and military communications, and Palantir Technologies, which provides data analytics and artificial intelligence platforms for military targeting and logistics, represent the technology-intensive dimension of defense that this conflict is highlighting. The third action is your gold position maintenance. Do not take profits on gold at current levels in this environment. The 3 pillars of the gold thesis, geopolitical uncertainty, inflation risk, and dollar alternatives, are all at their most robust since the conflict began. The Washington Post's ERC consolidation reporting, the Larijani assassination, the Fujairah attack on the contingency supply route, the Asian fuel shortages, all of these Day 18 developments reinforce the uncertainty and inflation pillars of the gold argument. The World Gold Council's data on sustained institutional inflows confirms that professional investors are reaching the same conclusion. This is not the moment to reduce gold. The fourth action is currency and emerging market exposure assessment. Dollar strength in this environment is producing pressure on emerging market currencies and emerging market equity markets. According to the Bank for International Settlements quarterly review data, the most comprehensive analysis of international capital flows and currency market dynamics, countries with high dollar debt burdens, large oil import requirements, and limited foreign exchange reserves are most vulnerable to the combination of strong dollar and high oil prices. The combination creates a triple squeeze: higher import costs in local currency, higher dollar debt service costs, and capital outflows seeking dollar safety. Screen your emerging market equity exposure for these vulnerability factors and consider reducing positions in the most exposed markets. The fifth action is fixed income positioning. The conventional role of government bonds as a safe haven in equity market stress is compromised in this particular environment. Long-duration government bonds, 10-year and 30-year Treasury bonds, face two competing forces. The safe haven demand provides support. The inflation expectations increase from higher oil prices provides headwind, pushing long-term yields upward and bond prices downward. The net effect is uncertain and depends on which force dominates in the coming weeks. Short-duration government securities, 2-year Treasury notes and Treasury bills, face much less duration risk and currently offer yields that are attractive in absolute terms given the currently elevated rate environment. They are a more defensible fixed income position in this environment than long duration. Treasury inflation-protected securities, TIPS, which adjust their principal value with changes in the consumer price index, are worth considering as an inflation hedge within fixed income. If the oil-driven inflation we have been tracing through this episode materializes in official consumer price index data over the next 3 to 6 months as expected, TIPS will outperform nominal bonds by the inflation rate differential. The iShares TIPS Bond ETF, ticker TIP, provides diversified exposure to the TIPS market. The sixth action is a supply chain vulnerability assessment for any business exposure. If you own a business or have equity exposure to businesses with complex international supply chains, conduct a specific vulnerability assessment focused on 3 questions. First, what share of this business's inputs transit through either the Strait of Hormuz or the Red Sea-Suez Canal route? Second, what is the additional cost per unit of the Cape of Good Hope rerouting that shipping companies are now using as an alternative? Third, what is the timing lag between higher shipping costs and the ability to pass them through to customers? The businesses most vulnerable are those with high input transit through affected routes, high rerouting cost as a percentage of margin, and long pricing power lags. These are the companies whose earnings guidance will disappoint most severely in the coming quarters. The seventh action is volatility management. The VIX, the Chicago Board Options Exchange's Volatility Index, which measures the implied volatility of S&P 500 options and serves as the market's primary fear gauge, has been elevated since this conflict began but has not reached the extreme levels associated with acute market panics. Current VIX levels suggest the market is pricing elevated but not extreme uncertainty. In environments where the VIX is elevated but below panic thresholds, option strategies that use volatility, buying protective puts, establishing collar structures, or purchasing inverse ETFs as portfolio hedges, can provide cost-effective protection against the scenario where the conflict escalates to levels that push markets toward genuine crisis pricing. The specific implementation depends on your portfolio and your access to options markets, but the principle of using currently elevated but not extreme volatility as a relatively efficient hedging environment is sound. The eighth action is the positive catalyst positioning. Everything discussed in this episode is risk management for the downside scenarios, but every crisis creates an eventual positive catalyst. In this conflict, as we have discussed, the most powerful positive catalyst is a credible movement toward Hormuz shipping restoration or toward diplomatic de-escalation. When that catalyst arrives, and it will arrive at some point because conflicts end, it will move markets fast and it will reward investors who are positioned to participate. Ensure that your current defensive positioning does not leave you completely unable to participate in the relief rally. Maintaining some exposure to broad equity markets alongside your defensive tilts. Maintaining your liquidity to deploy into cyclical names when the catalyst becomes credible. And having a clear framework for what signals you will use to determine when the risk profile has improved enough to increase your risk exposure. These are the preparations that allow you to benefit from the resolution, rather than being so defensively positioned that you watch the recovery from the sidelines. Section 16, the global economy at day 18. The complete damage assessment. Let me give you the complete current state damage assessment for the global economy, pulling together all of the threads from this episode and from the broader series into a single coherent picture of where things stand on day 18. Oil is 50% above pre-conflict levels, at approximately $103 per barrel according to The Guardian's market data. This is generating energy cost increases that are flowing through every sector of the global economy, and that will continue transmitting for months through the sequential channels: gasoline, transportation, industrial inputs, food, that we have traced in detail. Natural gas prices have risen significantly in parallel, compounding the energy cost shock in ways that particularly affect European industry, Asian power generation, and the desalination infrastructure of Gulf states. Shipping costs have increased significantly for all routes, not just those directly affected by the conflict, because fleet rerouting around Africa and increased insurance premiums have raised the cost base of global maritime logistics systemically. The International Monetary Fund, which revised its global growth projections in its most recent World Economic Outlook update before this conflict, began to approximately 3% for 2026, will in its next publication face the task of downward revising those projections to reflect the energy shock. Based on the IMF's own published scenario analysis, a supply disruption of the current magnitude sustained for a full year would reduce global growth by 1 to 2 percentage points, potentially taking it below 2% globally, a level consistent with global stagnation. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the international organization representing 38 major advanced and emerging market economies, publishes a similar global growth assessment in its Economic Outlook publications. Their framework also suggests growth reductions in the 1 to 1.5 percentage point range for a sustained supply shock of the current magnitude. United States equities, according to major index tracking data, have fallen approximately 4 to 5% from pre-conflict levels. This modest decline relative to the scale of the economic disruption visible in the oil, shipping, and inflation data reflects the market's continued base case assumption of a controlled outcome. The gap between market pricing and economic damage assessment is the central tension in the current investment environment, and it resolves in one of two ways. Either the situation improves enough to validate the modest equity decline, or the situation deteriorates further in ways that force a larger equity repricing toward the damage that the economic data is already reflecting. Asian equity markets have in many cases performed worse than American markets, reflecting the more direct energy cost exposure of oil-importing Asian economies. European equity markets, with their heavier industrial sector weighting and their direct exposure to natural gas price increases, have also underperformed American markets. Emerging market equity markets in oil-importing nations have been under the most pressure of all, for the combination of reasons: energy costs, dollar strength, reduced capital flows that we have traced across this series. Defense and energy sectors globally have outperformed the broad market, reflecting the structural tailwinds that the conflict is creating for those specific industries. Gold has outperformed both. Safe haven currencies, dollar, Swiss franc, Japanese yen, have strengthened against most others. This is the complete picture, clear-sourced, honest, and comprehensive. This is day 18. Closing the long view and the patient investor. Every episode of this series has ended with a variation of the same fundamental observation, and it bears stating again today because it is more true, more relevant, and more actionable on day 18 than it was on day 1. The conflict in the Middle East, with everything it is doing to energy markets, to global inflation, to supply chains, to central bank policy, to equity valuations, is genuinely consequential. More consequential, in terms of its likely economic legacy, than most financial crises of the past 20 years. The scale, the geographic spread, the infrastructure targeting, the leadership assassinations, the Hormuz closure, the Asian fuel shortages, all of it tells you that this is not a short-term disruption that resolves in weeks. It is a structural event that will take months to fully understand and years to fully recover from. But consequences take time to fully materialize. Markets price them in advance imperfectly, and then adjust as reality becomes clearer. The investor who understands what is happening, who can read the day 18 picture with the analytical clarity we have built across 8 episodes of this series, is not just better informed. They are specifically better positioned to make decisions that protect their capital through the uncertainty and capture the opportunities that the uncertainty creates. The sources are The Guardian on oil prices and infrastructure attacks, Al Jazeera on day 18 conflict developments, the Beaumont Enterprise on Trump's coalition call, Wikipedia on the Hormuz crisis and the Oman strikes, CBS News on the Hormuz reopening timeline, the Sunday Guardian on Fujairah, Reuters on the SAS flight cancellations and the Shah gas field suspension, the Washington Post on Iranian Revolutionary Guard consolidation, the Wall Street Journal on Iranian missile and drone counts, and the Quantitative Foundation from the International Energy Agency, the Energy Information Administration, the Asian Development Bank, the World Gold Council, the International Monetary Fund, and the Central Bureau Options Exchange. These are not anonymous sources or speculative claims. They are the institutions with the most rigorous methodologies, the most resources, and in many cases the most direct financial or institutional accountability for the accuracy of their analysis. When they agree, and on the fundamental picture of day 18, they largely agree, the agreement is informative. Watch the insurance market, watch the tanker traffic, watch the Federal Reserve's language, watch China's diplomatic engagement, watch the coalition naval deployment, watch the oil price levels relative to $100, $120, and $150. These are your signals. Be positioned for duration. Be patient. Be analytical. Be prepared for the positive catalyst. The war's economic anatomy. How every dollar of oil price becomes pain in your economy, and what the next phase looks like for investors who are paying attention. Welcome to Profit Pulse. There is a specific moment in every prolonged crisis when the noise of daily events, the missile counts, the leadership killings, the tanker traffic updates, the oil price ticks, begins to overwhelm the signal. When the volume of incoming information is so high, and the pace of events so relentless, that even attentive, thoughtful observers lose the thread of the deeper analysis. When the forest disappears behind the trees, we are approaching that moment in this conflict. 18 days of war, more than 290 missiles, more than 500 drones, oil infrastructure struck across 4 countries, the Strait of Hormuz effectively closed, leadership assassinations in Tehran, a naval coalition being assembled, fuel shortages emerging in Asia, Scandinavian airlines canceling 1,000 flights, 150 ships sitting idle outside the world's most important energy choke point. If you have been following this series, you know all of those facts. You have the timeline, you have the geographic picture, you have the specific sources, you have the cause and effect chains that run from the military event to the economic consequence to the market implication. What Part 9 is going to do is something different from what the previous episodes have done. Rather than layering more event coverage on top of what has already been built, we are going to step back and do something more analytically valuable at this stage of the conflict. We are going to dissect the economic anatomy of this war with a precision and a completeness that goes beyond anything you will find in mainstream financial media. We are going to trace, dollar by dollar and barrel by barrel, exactly how an oil price increase becomes inflation in your grocery store. Exactly how a shipping route disruption becomes a production slowdown at a factory in Ohio. Exactly how a central bank policy delay becomes a lower valuation on your equity portfolio. And exactly how the geopolitical fragmentation this war is accelerating will reshape the investment landscape for the next decade in ways that create specific opportunities for investors who understand the direction of structural change. And then, drawing on all of that analysis, we are going to do something intensely practical. We are going to build the most complete investor framework this series has produced, not just the what todo, but the when to do it, the how much to do it, and the specific signals that trigger each action in a clearly defined decision tree. This is the episode where all of the analysis becomes most actionable. So let us get into it. Section 1, the full economic anatomy. how oil price becomes grocery price, and how long it takes most financial coverage of oil price spikes stops at the obvious first-order effects. Gasoline costs more, airline tickets cost more, energy bills go up. These are real and they matter, but they are the beginning of the story, not the whole story. The full transmission mechanism, the complete anatomical pathway from crude oil price to consumer price across every sector of the economy, is substantially more complex, substantially more pervasive, and substantially more delayed than the first-order effects suggest. Understanding the full anatomy matters for investors for a specific and important reason. If you only track the first-order effects, you will underestimate both the severity and the duration of the inflationary impact of the current oil price surge. And underestimating the duration leads to underestimating how long the Federal Reserve will need to maintain its current rate posture, which leads to overestimating how quickly the rate tailwind for equities will return. Let me build the complete anatomy layer by layer with the specific timing of each transmission stage. The first layer is the direct energy price effect. This is what most people see and what most coverage focuses on. Crude oil at $103 per barrel versus $70 per barrel flows directly into the retail prices of petroleum products. Gasoline, diesel, heating oil, jet fuel, propane, kerosene. The American Automobile Association's daily national average gasoline price tracker shows that retail gasoline prices move within 1 to 2 weeks of meaningful changes in crude oil prices. The transmission is fast because the supply chain between crude and pump is short. Refining, blending, distribution, and retail are all high-velocity processes. The Consumer Price Index, which the Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes monthly, captures this first layer in its energy components. The energy index within CPI, which tracks gasoline, natural gas, electricity, and fuel oil, responds quickly and visibly to crude oil movements. The most recent CPI releases have already begun showing elevated energy inflation, and the full 50% crude oil price increase will not be fully captured in energy CPI until approximately 3 to 4 weeks after the conflict's beginning based on typical data collection and publication lags. The second layer is the transportation cost effect. This is where the oil price begins infecting the prices of everything else, and where most casual analysis stops tracking. Every physical good that moves from where it is made to where it is consumed requires transportation. Trucks, ships, trains, planes, all of these are powered by petroleum derivatives, diesel for trucks and trains, marine fuel oil for ships, jet fuel for air cargo. When petroleum prices rise 50%, the operating cost of every vehicle in every mode of transportation rises, not 50%, because fuel is a share of total operating cost, not the whole, but meaningfully. The American Trucking Association, which represents the firms that move approximately 70% of American freight by value, publishes a monthly trucking conditions index that tracks operating cost changes. Their data historically shows that a 30 to 40% increase in diesel prices, which is a conservative estimate of where diesel has moved given crude oil's 50% surge, increases total trucking operating costs by approximately 8 to 12%, after accounting for fuel surcharge mechanisms that partially pass costs to shippers. That 8 to 12% increase in trucking costs flows through to shippers, the manufacturers, retailers, distributors, and importers who pay truckers to move their goods. Shippers initially absorb some of this increase through margin compression. Then, when margin compression becomes unsustainable, they raise their own prices. The typical lag from trucking cost increase to wholesale price increase is 6 to 12 weeks. The lag from wholesale price increase to retail price increase is an additional 4 to 8 weeks. The cumulative effect: a 50% crude oil price increase, operating through the transportation cost channel alone, adds approximately 1.5 to 2.5% to the prices of a broad basket of consumer goods over a period of 3 to 6 months from the initial crude price spike. This is in addition to the direct energy price effect. They compound. The third layer is the industrial energy cost effect. Manufacturing uses energy directly, electricity, natural gas, and in some sectors direct petroleum inputs as a production input. When energy costs rise, manufacturing costs rise. According to data published by the United States Energy Information Administration's Manufacturing Energy Consumption Survey, the manufacturing sector consumes approximately 30 quadrillion British thermal units of energy per year, with natural gas being the single largest energy source, followed by electricity and petroleum products. When oil prices rise 50%, the cost implications for manufacturing are not uniform. Energy-intensive industries, steel, aluminum, glass, cement, chemicals, paper, food processing, textile manufacturing, face cost increases proportionally larger than the overall energy price increase, because energy represents a higher share of their total production costs. According to research published in the Journal of Industrial Economics, for the most energy-intensive manufacturing subsectors, a 50% energy price increase can raise total production costs by 15 to 25%, depending on the specific production process and the degree to which fuel substitution is possible. Those production cost increases flow into the prices of manufactured goods through the same sequence as transportation costs, first absorbed in margins, then passed through to wholesale prices, then to retail prices, with a similar lag structure of 3 to 6 months from the initial energy price shock. The fourth layer is the agricultural and food system effect. This is perhaps the most socially consequential transmission channel, and the one most likely to create political pressure on governments regardless of their other policy choices. Modern industrial agriculture is petroleum-dependent at every stage. Field operations, planting, cultivation, harvesting, run on diesel-powered equipment. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which publishes detailed analyses of food system energy inputs, mechanized farming operations account for approximately 30% of total agricultural energy consumption in developed economies. Irrigation systems, grain drying, cold storage, food processing, and packaging add further energy requirements. And the transportation of agricultural inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, seeds, and outputs, grain, produce, processed foods, from production to consumption, adds the transportation cost layer on top of the direct agricultural energy cost layer. But the most important agricultural energy input, the one that most directly and most rapidly translates oil price increases into food price increases, is fertilizer. Nitrogen-based fertilizers, which are the primary yield-enhancing agricultural input for most grain crops globally, are produced from natural gas through the Haber-Bosch process. Ammonia, the precursor to virtually all nitrogen fertilizers, is synthesized by combining nitrogen from the air with hydrogen derived from natural gas at high temperature and pressure. According to the International Fertilizer Association, natural gas represents approximately 70 to 90% of the total production cost of nitrogen-based fertilizers depending on the specific product and the production technology used. When natural gas prices rise, as they have in this conflict, both directly and in correlation with oil prices, fertilizer production costs rise proportionally. Fertilizer prices in global markets rise. Farmers face higher input costs. Farming economics deteriorate. Some farmers reduce fertilizer application to control costs, which reduces crop yields. Lower crop yields with the same global demand produces higher grain prices. Higher grain prices flow through the food system into the prices of bread, pasta, animal feed, meat, poultry, dairy, and the hundreds of other food products that depend on grain as a primary input. According to analysis published by the Food and Agriculture Organization's Food Price Index Tracking, which monitors global food commodity prices monthly, historically, a sustained 50% increase in energy prices produces a 20 to 30% increase in food commodity prices within 6 to 18 months, through the combined effect of direct agricultural energy costs, fertilizer price transmission, and transportation cost transmission. A 20 to 30% increase in food commodity prices is not a minor statistical perturbation. For the lowest income quintile of households in the United States, where food represents approximately 15 to 20% of household budgets, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey data, A 20% food price increase represents a 3 to 4 percentage point reduction in real purchasing power that cannot easily be accommodated by reducing other spending. For populations in developing nations where food represents 40 to 60% of household budgets, the impact is proportionally more severe. This is the anatomy of oil price transmission to food prices. It takes 12 to 18 months to fully manifest. It is already in motion, and it will compound the already visible direct energy price inflation in ways that make the total inflationary impact of this conflict significantly larger than the current CPI data yet shows. The fifth and final layer of the transmission anatomy is the expectations and wage price spiral dynamic. This is the transmission channel that Federal Reserve officials fear most, because it is the channel through which a temporary oil price shock can become a persistent structural inflation problem. When consumers and workers experience rising energy prices, rising transportation costs, rising food prices, and rising manufactured goods prices simultaneously, which is what the previous four layers describe, they form expectations about future inflation. According to the University of Michigan's Consumer Survey, one of the two primary measures of consumer inflation expectations tracked by the Federal Reserve, 5-year-ahead inflation expectations are already moving upward since the conflict began. The New York Federal Reserve's monthly survey of consumer expectations shows a similar pattern. When inflation expectations rise, workers demand higher wages to compensate for the expected erosion of their real purchasing power. When employers grant higher wages, either through collective bargaining, market competition for labor, or minimum wage adjustments, their production costs rise. When production costs rise, they raise prices. When prices rise, expectations rise further. This is the wage price spiral that the Federal Reserve has been working since 2022 to prevent from becoming entrenched. The critical threshold, the point at which expectations become self-fulfilling rather than merely reactive, is not precisely measurable in advance. But the Federal Reserve's own research, published in the Fed Notes series on its public website, identifies sustained 5-year-ahead inflation expectations above 3% as a warning threshold above which the risk of expectations entrenchment rises materially. Current surveys are approaching, but not yet crossing that threshold. The oil price of this conflict is pushing those expectations upward. Every month that oil stays above $100, every monthly CPI release that shows elevated inflation, every gas price sign that reminds consumers that energy costs more than it did before, all of these feed the expectation formation process. And the Federal Reserve, aware of this dynamic, will resist cutting rates precisely because cutting rates would signal to expectation-forming consumers and workers that the inflation fight is over, even if underlying conditions do not yet warrant that conclusion. This expectations management dimension of Federal Reserve policy is why the rate cut timeline keeps being pushed further out, and why equity markets face a more sustained headwind from elevated rates than would be justified by any single month's economic data. Section 2, the shipping crisis in granular detail. What 3 disrupted choke points due to the global trade system? We have discussed the Strait of Hormuz extensively throughout this series. We have mentioned the Red Sea and the Suez Canal route, but I want to do something in this section that has not been done in the previous episodes. Give you the complete, integrated picture of what 3 simultaneously disrupted maritime choke points due to the global trade system as a whole, not as 3 separate problems, but as a combined systemic stress that affects the routing and economics of virtually all global maritime trade. The global maritime shipping system, which carries approximately 90% of international trade by volume, according to the International Maritime Organization's annual World Maritime Review, depends on a set of critical choke points through which the vast majority of traffic must pass. When multiple choke points are simultaneously under stress, the system does not experience the sum of 3 separate disruptions. It experiences a compounding disruption that is geometrically more severe than any individual choke point's impact alone. The 3 choke points currently under simultaneous stress are the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb passage at its southern entrance, and the Suez Canal, which connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean and is only viable if the Red Sea approach is navigable. The Strait of Hormuz, as documented in detail throughout this series, handles approximately 20% of global oil supply and 20% of global liquefied natural gas trade. Its effective closure, with more than 150 ships waiting outside according to current maritime tracking data, is the most acute single choke point stress. The Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb passage is the route through which vessels transiting from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea, and vice versa, would normally travel before entering the Suez Canal. This route carries approximately 12 to 15% of global trade by volume, according to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, including manufactured goods, consumer products, electronic components, and bulk commodities moving between Asia and Europe. The Houthi attack campaign that preceded this conflict had already severely disrupted this route. The current conflict has intensified those disruptions, both by providing additional motivation and potential capability to Houthi forces, and by diverting naval assets that might otherwise have been available for Red Sea security to the Persian Gulf. With both of these routes under simultaneous stress, the global shipping fleet has been forced onto alternative routes, primarily around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. According to data published by the Danish shipping industry think tank Sea Intelligence, which tracks global container shipping movements and costs, the percentage of Asiato-Europe container traffic routing around the Cape of Good Hope rather than through the Suez Canal has increased dramatically since the combined disruptions began. What was a minor alternative route used for a small fraction of traffic has become the primary routing option for a large share of global trade. The Cape of Good Hope routing adds approximately 10 to 15 days to the Asia-Europe voyage, as documented by multiple shipping research firms. But there is a secondary constraint on this alternative that is less discussed, and that is becoming increasingly significant as traffic volumes on the route increase. The Cape of Good Hope routing passes through South African and Southern Atlantic waters that are less optimized for the traffic volumes now being forced through them. Port infrastructure along the alternative route in South Africa, in West Africa, and in the Atlantic islands that serve as waypoints was not sized for the volume of traffic now using it. Congestion is emerging at these alternative waypoints. Fuel bunkering capacity along the alternative route is being stressed by the dramatically higher number of vessels requiring fuel stops. And the weather conditions in the South Atlantic, particularly during the Southern Hemisphere's winter months, are more challenging for navigation than the Red Sea route, adding further delays beyond the simple geographic distance. The cumulative result of 3 disrupted choke points forcing traffic onto an under-resourced alternative route is a global shipping system that is running slower, more expensively, less reliably, and with less total effective capacity than at any point since the peak of the pandemic supply chain crisis. According to research published by the Peterson Institute for International Economics, a Washington-based think tank specializing in international economic policy, the combined shipping cost increases from the current disruptions are running at levels that, if sustained for a full year, would add approximately 0.5 to 1 percentage point to global consumer price inflation through the shipping cost transmission channel alone. Added to the direct energy price inflation, the agricultural input inflation, and the transportation cost inflation, the total inflationary package from this conflict's supply chain disruption is running well above what conventional analyst forecasts had incorporated in their models at the conflict's start. Section 3, the petrodollar architecture under stress. The slow-moving structural change that will matter for a decade, there is a dimension of this conflict's long-term economic significance that most daily market commentary completely ignores because its effects unfold over years, not days. But for investors with a decade-long perspective, the kind of perspective that generates the most significant wealth creation, it may ultimately be the most important dimension of all. The petrodollar system, and the quiet but accelerating challenge this conflict is presenting to it. Let me explain what the petrodollar system is, how it works, and why its potential structural change over the next decade has profound implications for every investor holding dollar-denominated assets. The petrodollar system was established in the early 1970s as part of the broader diplomatic architecture surrounding the end of the Bretton Woods gold standard. Following the Nixon administration's decision to close the gold window in 1971, ending the convertibility of dollars to gold at a fixed rate, the dollar needed a new source of demand to maintain its value and its reserve currency status. The mechanism that emerged through diplomatic agreements between the United States and Saudi Arabia in 1973 and 1974, documented in academic histories of international monetary policy, including Barry Eichengreen's book Exorbitant Privilege, was the petrodollar arrangement. Under this arrangement, Saudi Arabia and other major oil-producing nations agreed to price their oil exports in United States dollars exclusively. In exchange, they received American security guarantees and access to American financial markets for investing their oil revenues. The effect was to create a permanent global demand for dollars. Every nation that needed to buy oil, which is every nation, needed to hold dollars to do so. This dollar demand supported the dollar's value, kept American interest rates lower than they would otherwise be, and gave the United States an economic advantage, the exorbitant privilege that economists refer to that no other nation has ever held in the modern era. The petrodollar system has been the foundation of American economic hegemony for 50 years. It is why the dollar is the world's reserve currency. It is why the United States can run large current account deficits without the currency collapse that would afflict any other nation doing the same. It is why Treasury bonds can be sold at relatively low yields to global investors who need to hold dollar assets as part of their reserve management. It is, in short, one of the most important structural advantages the American economy possesses. And this conflict is accelerating the forces that are gradually eroding it. Consider the sequence of events this conflict has set in motion from the perspective of the Gulf states, whose oil pricing decisions are central to the petrodollar system's continued functioning. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, Kuwait, the countries whose oil pricing choices created and sustained the petrodollar arrangement, are watching a conflict in which the United States is an active belligerent that has created an energy supply emergency in their region, exposed their own infrastructure to Iranian attack, and pulled them toward a military confrontation they did not choose and do not want. The American security guarantee, the other side of the petrodollar bargain, is being tested against its actual value in a conflict where Gulf states are themselves taking fire. Meanwhile, China, the alternative partner that these Gulf states have been increasingly engaging with through the Belt and Road Initiative, through arms purchases, through diplomatic agreements, and through energy trade, is offering something different. Investment without entanglement, trade without military baggage, and an explicit desire to price some of that trade in yuan rather than dollars. The petro-yuan concept that Saudi Arabia and China have been discussing in public diplomatic exchanges for several years. According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal from early 2023, before this conflict began, Saudi Arabia was already in active discussions with China about pricing some oil sales in Chinese yuan. According to Reuters reporting from the same period, the Shanghai International Energy Exchange was specifically designed to allow yuan-denominated oil futures trading, and Chinese crude oil imports from Middle Eastern producers were already increasingly settled in a mix of currencies rather than exclusively in dollars. This conflict is not going to end the petrodollar system next week, or next month, or next year. The dollar's reserve currency status is supported by institutional infrastructure. The SWIFT payment system, the correspondent banking network, the depth and liquidity of treasury markets, the legal and regulatory frameworks of American financial markets, that cannot be replicated quickly regardless of political will. But it is going to accelerate the marginal drift away from exclusive dollar dependence that has been building for years. According to the International Monetary Fund's own data on global foreign exchange reserve composition, published in their Currency Composition of Official Foreign Exchange Reserves report, the dollar share of global reserves has declined from approximately 70% in the early 2000s to approximately 58% in the most recent measurement, even though no comparable alternative reserve currency has emerged. The decline reflects a gradual diversification by central banks globally, adding gold, euros, renminbi, and other currencies at the margin. That diversification trend is going to accelerate after this conflict. Every central bank in a Gulf state or in an oil-importing developing nation that has watched the United States use dollar dominance as a tool of foreign policy, through sanctions on Iran, through the asset freezes on Russian reserves following the Ukraine conflict, is making its own calculation about the risk of exclusive dollar dependence. The calculation does not produce a sudden shift. It produces a gradual, measured, long-term diversification that reduces dollar demand at the margin. For investors, the petrodollar erosion trend has specific implications. It suggests that dollar strength, which has been a defining characteristic of the current conflict's financial market impact, may be a cyclical phenomenon that reverts as the conflict resolves, rather than a permanent structural change. It suggests that gold, as the asset most directly benefiting from central bank reserve diversification, has long-term structural demand support that goes beyond the current conflict's specific fear premium. And it suggests that yuan-denominated financial assets and Chinese financial market exposure may merit increasing attention as the alternative financial architecture gradually builds more depth and more credibility. Section 4, the Defense Industry Supercycle. A decade-long investment theme with current conflict as catalyst, let me now develop the defense investment thesis with a completeness and a specificity that goes beyond what we have covered in previous episodes. Because the defense theme is not just about the current conflict, it is about a decade-long structural increase in global defense spending that the current conflict has catalyzed. And understanding the full scope of that structural increase is essential for sizing the investment opportunity correctly. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, is the world's most authoritative source of data on global military spending. Its annual military expenditure database, which is the gold standard for this data globally, shows that global military spending reached $2,443 billion in 2023. The most recent year for which SIPRI has published comprehensive data, representing the 9th consecutive year of increase and the highest level in real terms since the Cold War era. That trend was already firmly established before this conflict began, driven by the Russia-Ukraine conflict's impact on European defense spending, by the United States-China strategic competition's impact on American and Asian defense budgets, and by the broader recognition across governments globally that the post-Cold War peace dividend era, in which defense spending had been gradually reduced as a share of GDP, was definitively over. The 2026 Iran conflict is not creating this trend. It is accelerating it, broadening it, and extending it in ways that add years to the duration of the defense spending supercycle. Let me give you the specific quantification of the acceleration. NATO, the military alliance whose members include the United States, Canada, and 30 European nations, had set a collective defense spending target of 2% of GDP for all members. According to NATO's own annual reporting on Allied defense contributions, only a minority of members were meeting that target before the conflict began. Most European nations were spending below 2% despite years of diplomatic pressure from the United States. The Russia-Ukraine conflict had already moved the political needle significantly, with many European nations accelerating their defense budget increases. The Iran conflict, by demonstrating simultaneously that major conventional warfare between advanced military powers is not a historical artifact, that energy supply can be weaponized with severe economic consequences, and that American military capacity is stretched in ways that reduce the reliability of extended deterrence guarantees, has produced a political environment in European capitals where defense spending below 2% is now politically indefensible. Several European nations, including Germany, France, Poland, and the Nordic countries, are now discussing targets of 3% or even higher. According to projections from the NATO Secretary General's office, cited in Financial Times reporting on European defense budgets, European NATO member defense spending is expected to increase by several $100 billion annually above current levels, if the political commitments currently being made are followed through. The procurement pipeline for equipment to meet those commitments, aircraft, missiles, air defense systems, vehicles, ships, cyber capabilities, will sustain elevated defense industry revenues for a decade. In Asia, the acceleration is equally significant, but takes a different form. Japan's defense spending trajectory, which we discussed in the previous episode in the context of the energy transition, is equally dramatic in the defense dimension. Japan has historically spent approximately 1% of GDP on defense, a self-imposed limit rooted in the post-World War II pacifist constitutional tradition. According to Japan's Ministry of Defense budget documentation, Japan has committed to doubling defense spending to 2% of GDP by 2027. At Japan's GDP of approximately $4 trillion, that represents an additional $40 billion annually in defense procurement. South Korea, Australia, Taiwan, the Philippines, and India are all engaged in similar defense spending acceleration trajectories, all driven by the same fundamental strategic reassessment. The era of relying primarily on American extended deterrence, without adequate indigenous defense capability, has become too risky given the American military's demonstrated capacity constraints. The cumulative global defense spending increase implied by these commitments, combining European NATO expansion, Asian ally buildup, and sustained American defense spending at its own elevated baseline, represents the largest sustained increase in global defense procurement since the Cold War arms race. And unlike the Cold War arms race, which was concentrated in a small number of very expensive platforms, aircraft carriers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, strategic bombers, the current procurement cycle is spread across a much wider range of capability types, many of which are more commercially accessible and more production scalable. Let me give you the specific capability categories where the procurement demand is highest and where the investment opportunity is most concentrated. Air defense systems. This conflict has consumed air defense interceptors, Patriot PAC-3 missiles, Arrow 3 interceptors, Iron Dome Tamir missiles at rates that have visibly depleted stockpiles. According to analysis published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies in its ongoing coverage of weapons transfers and stockpile management, the United States Army's Patriot missile stockpile had already been under stress from transfers to Ukraine and from domestic training requirements before this conflict began. The conflict's consumption rate has intensified that stress. Every ally that observes this conflict and does not have adequate air defense coverage is now urgently seeking to procure or expand coverage. Raytheon Technologies, which manufactures the Patriot system and its interceptors, and Lockheed Martin, which manufactures the THAAD system and its kill vehicle, are the primary American beneficiaries. Precision-guided munitions. The air campaign being conducted in this conflict is consuming precision-guided munitions, specifically the GPS-guided and laser-guided bombs and the cruise missiles used in standoff attacks at significant rates. The Joint Direct Attack Munition Kit, which converts unguided bombs into precision weapons and manufactured by Boeing Defense, has been used in large quantities. The Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, manufactured by Lockheed Martin, and the Tomahawk cruise missile, manufactured by Raytheon, have both been employed. Production rates for all of these systems need to increase significantly to replenish what has been consumed, and to build the additional stockpiles that military planners now recognize as necessary given the consumption rates demonstrated by this conflict. Drone systems and counter-drone technology. The 500 drone attacks documented in this conflict, including the Iranian drones and the Houthi drones and the various proxy-operated systems, have demonstrated both the offensive power and the defensive vulnerability to drone warfare that military planners globally have been theorizing about but have now seen in practice at unprecedented scale. Every military that does not have adequate counter-drone capability is now urgently seeking it. Northrop Grumman's counter-drone systems, Anduril Industries' autonomous defense platforms, and Shield AI's artificial intelligence-powered drone systems are all in categories receiving urgent attention. According to a report published by the Association of Unmanned Vehicle Systems International, the primary trade organization for the drone industry. The global military drone and counter-drone market is projected to exceed $4 to $5 billion annually by 2028, based on procurement projections that were made before this conflict began. Those projections are being revised upward by every major defense market research firm in response to the demonstrated demand this conflict has created. Military communications and electronic warfare. Modern warfare is fought as much in the electromagnetic spectrum as in the physical domain. Electronic warfare, the use of electromagnetic energy to disrupt, deceive, and destroy adversary systems, and military communications security have been highlighted as critical capabilities by the conduct of this conflict. L3Harris Technologies, which is the primary American supplier of military communications systems, and Northrop Grumman's Electronic Warfare Division are positioned to benefit. Cybersecurity and offensive cyber capabilities. We have discussed the cyber warfare dimension of this conflict in detail across this series. The investment implication, demand for both defensive cyber capabilities protecting critical infrastructure and for offensive cyber capabilities integrated into military operations, is substantial. CrowdStrike Holdings and Palantir Technologies, among others, have defense-relevant product lines in these categories. For investors evaluating defense sector exposure, the key insight is that the procurement cycle being initiated by this conflict is not a 1 to 3 year phenomenon. Based on the historical pattern of procurement cycles following major conflict catalysts, combined with the specific structural factors, European NATO spending increases, Asian ally capability building, global stockpile replenishment, the defense spending supercycle has a credible 10 to 15 year duration. Investments made in the leading defense companies today, at current valuations that reflect elevated but not extreme premiums, are positioning for a multi-year structural theme rather than a short-term tactical trade. Section 5. The Central Bank Trilemma. What happens when monetary policy has no good options? The Federal Reserve and its counterpart central banks in Europe, the United Kingdom, Japan, and across the emerging world are facing what academic economists have described as a policy trilemma, a situation in which three desirable policy objectives are simultaneously unachievable, forcing policymakers to choose which objective to sacrifice. The three objectives are price stability, inflation at or near the 2% target, financial stability, avoiding the kind of credit market and banking sector stress that accompanies rapid tightening, and growth support, maintaining interest rates at levels that allow the economy to grow rather than contract. Before this conflict began, the Federal Reserve had reason to believe it was approaching a period in which all three objectives could be approximately satisfied. Inflation was declining toward target. The economy was growing, though slowly. Financial conditions were elevated, but not severely restrictive. The rate cut cycle that the market was pricing, 3 cuts of 25 basis points each in 2026, was a scenario in which price stability, financial stability, and growth support were all achievable simultaneously. The conflict has eliminated that scenario. By generating a supply-side inflation shock of substantial magnitude, it has made simultaneous achievement of all three objectives impossible. And the specific form of the impossibility is what investors need to understand clearly to position correctly. If the Federal Reserve prioritizes price stability, fights the inflation from oil prices, it must maintain high interest rates or even consider further hikes. High rates in a slowing economy risk tipping growth into contraction. Contraction raises unemployment. Unemployment weakens consumer spending. Weakened consumer spending reduces corporate revenue. Reduced corporate revenue produces earnings disappointments. Earnings disappointments produce equity market declines. This path sacrifices growth and financial stability in service of price stability. If the Federal Reserve prioritizes growth support, cuts rates to prevent a recession, it allows oil-driven inflation to persist and potentially to entrench into expectations. Once inflation expectations are unanchored, re-anchoring them, as the Volcker experience in the early 1980s demonstrated, requires extremely painful tightening that is more economically costly than maintaining discipline in the first place. This path risks sacrificing price stability in service of near-term growth, with the long-term cost of re-establishing price credibility being substantially higher than the short-term cost avoided. If the Federal Reserve attempts to balance between the two, holding rates approximately stable, neither cutting to support growth nor hiking to fight inflation, it risks achieving neither objective fully. Inflation does not return to target. Growth does not recover to potential. The economy enters a period of below-trend growth with above-target inflation, the stagflation condition that is the most economically damaging and politically corrosive combination because there is no clean policy response available. Historical precedent for supply-driven stagflation: the 1974 to 1976 period, the 1979 to 1982 period, suggests that this last outcome, the holding pattern, tends to be the initial response before eventually being replaced by a more decisive choice in one direction or the other. The holding pattern typically lasts 1 to 3 years, during which equity markets underperform significantly relative to inflation, bonds lose real value, and commodities, particularly gold, oil, and agricultural products, outperform. According to research published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, the American Economic Research Organization, that officially dates business cycles and publishes working papers on macroeconomic policy, the sectors that have historically outperformed during stagflation episodes include energy producers, gold and precious metals miners, agricultural commodity producers, and defense-linked industrial companies. The sectors that have historically underperformed include long-duration growth equities, consumer discretionary companies, financial companies with long-duration fixed-rate assets, and highly leveraged businesses that cannot service debt costs with suppressed revenue. The investment positioning implications of the stagflation base case are the same as the positioning we have been building across this series, but held with greater conviction and for a longer expected duration. The structural allocation to energy, gold, defense, and real assets is not a trade on a short-term price move. It is a portfolio adaptation to a multi-year macroeconomic regime that the conflict has accelerated into becoming the dominant reality. Section 6. Geopolitical Risk Premium. What IT is, how IT is measured, and why IT matters for every asset class. There is a concept that professional investors use that most financial media coverage never explains adequately. But that is central to understanding the current market environment and why it is behaving the way it is. That concept is the geopolitical risk premium. Every risky asset, every stock, every corporate bond, every real estate investment, every currency that is not a recognized safe haven, is priced at a level that reflects the expected return from that asset minus a risk premium. The risk premium is what investors demand as compensation for the possibility that the expected return does not materialize. Risk premiums are composed of multiple components: business risk, financial risk, liquidity risk, and, in times of elevated geopolitical tension, geopolitical risk. In periods of low geopolitical tension, the kind of relatively peaceful, stable international environment that prevailed through most of the 1990s and 2000s, the geopolitical risk premium embedded in most asset prices is minimal. Investors are not demanding much additional return for the risk that a geopolitical shock will disrupt the expected economic environment. The geopolitical risk premium is, essentially, priced out of the market. In periods of high geopolitical tension, periods like the current one, the geopolitical risk premium increases. Investors demand more expected return to compensate for the heightened probability that a geopolitical shock will disrupt corporate cash flows, economic growth, and financial market functioning. And when investors demand more expected return, they pay less for any given level of current earnings or cash flow. Price-to-earnings ratios compress, bond spreads widen, valuations contract. The critical point for investors to understand is that the geopolitical risk premium is not uniformly distributed across all assets. Some assets carry almost no geopolitical risk premium: American government bonds, gold, and the currencies of politically neutral nations like Switzerland. These assets are priced as safe havens precisely because their value is relatively robust to geopolitical shocks. Other assets carry very high geopolitical risk premiums. Companies with operations in unstable regions, businesses deeply dependent on disrupted supply chains, financial institutions with exposure to sanctioned entities or politically unstable economies. The width of this distribution, the gap between the most geopolitically sensitive assets and the safest ones, is a direct measure of overall market fear. And it is a measure that is currently widening. The practical investment implication is that geopolitical risk premium compression, the narrowing of this distribution as geopolitical tensions ease, is one of the most powerful positive return generators in financial markets. When geopolitical tensions ease after a period of elevated stress, the assets that had been penalized most heavily by the elevated geopolitical risk premium recover the most dramatically. High-quality growth equities, emerging market stocks, corporate bonds, and risk assets broadly see significant valuation expansion as investors no longer demand the same premium for holding them. This means that the current period of elevated geopolitical risk premium, painful as it is for broadly invested portfolios, is also the period in which the seeds of future outperformance are being planted. The investors who maintain disciplined exposure to high-quality risk assets through the elevated geopolitical risk premium period, rather than selling out entirely into safety assets at the worst time, will participate most fully in the premium compression that follows when the geopolitical environment improves. Section 7. The Energy Independence Investment Opportunity. Mapping the decade-long capital allocation, let me now do something with the energy independence investment theme that we have mentioned in previous episodes but not fully mapped. Let me give you the specific subsectors, the specific technologies, the specific deployment scale, and the specific investment vehicles through which the energy transition acceleration catalyzed by this conflict becomes investable over a decade-long horizon. The energy independence investment opportunity is not a single trade. It is a portfolio of related but distinct investment themes, each with its own timeline, its own technology risk profile, its own geographic concentration, and its own return characteristics. Understanding the structure of the opportunity allows you to build exposure in a way that is appropriately diversified across subthemes rather than concentrated in a single expression of the broader trend. The first subtheme is utility-scale solar power generation and manufacturing. According to the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, which publishes the most comprehensive global renewable energy deployment data, solar photovoltaic capacity additions globally reached approximately 300 gigawatts in 2023, up from essentially zero 2 decades earlier. The Bloomberg NEF New Energy Outlook projects that solar capacity additions will need to triple or quadruple from current rates to achieve energy security and climate objectives simultaneously. Objectives that this conflict has demonstrated are not separate but deeply intertwined. The investment opportunity in solar spans the manufacturing supply chain, polysilicon production, wafer fabrication, cell manufacturing, module assembly, and the project development, ownership, and operations segment. On the manufacturing side, the Inflation Reduction Act's domestic manufacturing incentives have catalyzed significant American investment in solar manufacturing capacity, with facilities being built by companies including First Solar, the only major American solar panel manufacturer, and by international manufacturers including Hanwha Qcells, which has announced major American manufacturing investments. On the project development and ownership side, the leading American companies include NextEra Energy, which is the world's largest producer of wind and solar energy, and whose regulated utility operations provide stable, predictable cash flows alongside its renewable generation growth. Clearway Energy and Pattern Energy are other large-scale clean energy project developers and owners with publicly traded securities. The second subtheme is battery storage. Solar and wind energy are intermittent. They produce power only when the sun shines or the wind blows. The ability to store that energy for use when the sun does not shine and the wind does not blow is the key technology challenge that determines how much solar and wind can ultimately displace fossil fuels in power generation. Battery energy storage systems, predominantly using lithium-ion chemistry at current commercial scale, are the primary near-term solution, with longer duration alternatives including iron-air batteries, vanadium flow batteries, and compressed air storage developing for specific applications. According to Bloomberg NEF's annual battery price survey, the cost of lithium-ion battery storage has declined approximately 90% over the past decade, making utility-scale battery storage economically viable for a growing range of applications. The conflict is accelerating the regulatory and policy environment for storage deployment by making grid resilience and energy security priorities that override ordinary cost-benefit thresholds. Companies including Tesla's energy division, Fluence Energy, a joint venture between Siemens and AES Corporation, and STEM Inc. are leaders in the utility-scale battery storage deployment market. The third subtheme is nuclear energy. Nuclear power provides continuous, weather-independent, zero-carbon electricity generation with no oil or gas dependency. Its political fortunes have historically been volatile. The Chernobyl and Fukushima accidents generated enormous anti-nuclear sentiment that resulted in capacity reductions in several major economies. But the energy security arguments for nuclear, always present, have been dramatically strengthened by this conflict. Japan's accelerated nuclear restart program, discussed earlier, is the most immediate expression of this shift. Germany's political environment, which had previously settled on complete nuclear phase-out by 2023, is being revisited as energy security considerations reassert themselves against climate-driven anti-nuclear positions. The United States, through the Biden administration's Civil Nuclear Credit Program and the Inflation Reduction Act's production tax credit for existing nuclear plants, has moved to preserve its existing nuclear fleet. And a new generation of small modular reactor technology, compact nuclear reactors that can be factory manufactured and deployed at smaller scale than conventional nuclear plants, is advancing toward commercial deployment. NuScale Power, which has received design approval from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for its small modular reactor design. Kairos Power, Terrestrial Energy, and several other small modular reactor developers represent the forward-looking nuclear investment opportunity, albeit with higher technology and regulatory risk than established utilities. The fourth subtheme is grid infrastructure and modernization. The energy transition requires not just new generation capacity, but a fundamentally transformed electricity grid, one capable of integrating intermittent renewable generation at high penetration levels, of managing bidirectional power flows from distributed generation sources, of supporting the electrification of transportation and heating that reduces oil dependence, and of maintaining reliability through cyber attacks and extreme weather events that the current geopolitical environment makes more likely. Grid modernization investment is largely invisible to ordinary investors because it occurs within regulated utility operations rather than through standalone investment vehicles. But the companies that manufacture the transformers, switches, cables, sensors, and control systems that the grid requires, including ABB, Siemens Energy, Eaton Corporation, Quanta Services, and MYR Group, are infrastructure suppliers with revenue directly tied to the grid modernization investment cycle. According to the Edison Electric Institute, the trade organization representing American investor-owned electric utilities, the American electricity industry is projecting investment of approximately $1 trillion in grid infrastructure over the next decade, a figure that was established before this conflict began, and that is likely to be revised upward in response to the energy security arguments the conflict has reinforced. Section 8, the Investor's Decision Tree. A complete framework for every market scenario. I want to build something in this section that I have not built in any previous episode of this series. A complete operational decision tree, a framework that tells you specifically what to do, when to do it, and what signals trigger each decision, across every market scenario that this conflict might produce. This is the most practically valuable thing this episode can provide, because analysis without an operational framework is interesting but not actionable. And in the current environment, the ability to act quickly and correctly when a significant signal arrives is what separates investors who profit from the resolution of this crisis from those who watch it happen. Let me structure this decision tree around 5 specific signal events. Events that, if they occur, would definitively shift the scenario probabilities and require portfolio adjustments. For each signal event, I will tell you what it means, how to recognize it, and what specific portfolio action it calls for. The first signal event is a credible ceasefire announcement. How to recognize it? An official announcement from a government, Iranian, American, or Israeli, or from a recognized intermediary such as Qatar or China, of a ceasefire agreement, a humanitarian pause, or a framework for negotiations that has been accepted by all primary parties. Credibility indicators include specific duration and terms are stated, not vague calls for restraint. At least one senior official from each relevant party has publicly accepted the terms, and military operations have visibly reduced or stopped according to independent monitoring. What it means for markets: the largest single positive market catalyst available in the current environment. Oil fear premium dissolves rapidly. Brent could fall $15 to $25 per barrel within days. Equity markets rally broadly. 5 to 10% in major indices is plausible within the week of announcement. Defense stocks give back some recent gains. Airlines surge on fuel cost relief. Consumer discretionary recovers. What to do? In the hours following a credible ceasefire announcement, deploy cash reserves into broad market equity exposure, specifically into the sectors most penalized during the conflict. Consumer discretionary, airlines, global manufacturing. Reduce gold allocation modestly from peak levels. Maintain energy exposure, but begin assessing whether to rotate from pure energy producers toward energy infrastructure companies as the price level normalizes. Maintain defense exposure. Ceasefire does not reverse the defense spending supercycle. It merely removes the most acute near-term catalyst. The second signal event is successful Hormuz convoy operations. How to recognize it? Reports from maritime tracking services, including Kepler and Lloyd's, list showing a meaningful and sustained increase in tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Shipping company announcements of resumed transit operations. War risk insurance premium reductions cited by Lloyd's of London market sources. More than 5 major tankers successfully transiting with naval escort within a 7 to 2 hour period. What it means for markets: a significant but partial positive catalyst, less powerful than a ceasefire because the conflict continues but the most severe acute supply disruption is being addressed. Oil falls perhaps $10 to $15 per barrel from pre-convoy levels. Inflation expectations ease modestly. Federal Reserve rate cut probability recovers somewhat. Equities rally, perhaps 3 to 5% broadly. What to do? Selectively reduce oil price sensitivity in your energy exposure. Shift from pure upstream oil producers toward integrated majors with downstream refining operations, which benefit less from very high crude prices but are more resilient as crude normalizes. Begin modest deployment of cash into higher quality cyclical equities. Maintain gold allocation. The underlying geopolitical uncertainty has not resolved, only the most acute supply bottleneck. Maintain defense exposure unchanged. The third signal event is oil breaking above $120 per barrel. How to recognize it? Brent crude on any major commodity exchange closing above $120 for 2 consecutive trading sessions. The threshold itself is the signal. The specific level is widely watched by professional traders and generates its own momentum when crossed. What it means for markets: the conflict has escalated beyond the controlled conflict scenario into the major supply shock scenario. Central bank rate cut expectations are definitively removed from the calendar. Recession probability models begin crossing 50%. Corporate earnings estimates for the next 2 quarters will be revised lower across most non-energy sectors. What to do? Increase defensive positioning urgently. Reduce or eliminate airline exposure. Reduce consumer discretionary exposure. Increase gold to maximum portfolio weight consistent with your overall investment policy. Increase cash allocation. Consider adding explicit portfolio hedges through options on equity indices or through inverse exchange-traded funds if available to you. Within energy, rotate toward oil producers with the lowest production costs and highest profit margins at elevated price levels. These companies generate the most cash per barrel and have the most resilience in a high-volatility price environment. The fourth signal event is confirmed Saudi Arabia military engagement. How to recognize it? Official Saudi government statements or confirmed reporting from multiple credible sources that Saudi military forces have conducted offensive operations against Iranian targets, or that Saudi Arabia has formally declared a state of war or emergency with respect to Iran. What it means for markets: the regional war scenario is beginning to materialize. Oil moves immediately and sharply toward the $130 to $150 range. Global recession probability approaches and may exceed 50% in real-time forecasting models. This is the event that most severely tests portfolio construction. What to do? Execute maximum defensive positioning immediately. This is not a time for careful analysis of individual positions. It is a time for rapid, systematic implementation of preplanned defensive protocols. Reduce all non-defensive equity exposure to minimum levels. Maximize gold, cash, and short-duration government bonds. If you have the capability and the appropriate risk profile, consider commodity positions directly in crude oil as a hedge against the supply shock. This is also the event at which the eventual recovery becomes most powerful. The resolution of a regional war scenario will produce an enormous market recovery. Ensure that your defensive positioning preserves enough liquidity to participate in that recovery. The fifth signal event is visible Federal Reserve pivot language. How to recognize it? A Federal Open Market Committee statement, a Federal Reserve Chairman public speech, or testimony to Congress that explicitly signals openness to rate cuts in the near term, or that reduces the emphasis on inflation risk relative to growth risk in the Fed's dual mandate framework. This signal requires careful reading of nuanced language. The Fed communicates through carefully chosen words, and the shift from hawkish to dovish language is often subtle in its early stages. What it means for markets: the Federal Reserve has concluded that the growth risk now outweighs the inflation risk, either because the conflict is de-escalating and the energy shock is beginning to subside, or because the economic slowdown has become severe enough to override the inflation concern. Either interpretation is positive for interest rate-sensitive equity sectors. What to do? Increase exposure to growth-oriented equities, technology, healthcare, consumer staples that have been penalized by elevated rate expectations. Extend duration in fixed income. Move from short treasury bills toward intermediate-term bonds that benefit more from falling yields. Reduce cash allocation as the risk-adjusted return to holding cash versus holding quality equities improves. Maintain defensive thematic exposures, energy, defense, gold, but reduce their weight modestly in favor of the growth sectors that benefit most from the monetary policy pivot. Section 9. The psychological discipline of investing through a crisis. The most underrated skill. I want to spend time in this section on something that is usually left out of investment analysis, but that, in my experience studying investor behavior, is as important as the analytical framework itself. The psychological discipline required to invest through a crisis. Research on investor behavior during periods of market stress, conducted by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's pioneering work on behavioral economics. By Robert Shiller's research on investor psychology, published in his book Irrational Exuberance. And by more recent work from institutions including the Dalbar research firm, which publishes an annual study of investor returns versus market returns. Consistently shows that individual investor returns during periods of market stress are significantly below the returns of the markets themselves. Not because the markets did not produce returns, But because investors made poor timing decisions driven by psychological biases that caused them to sell at the worst times and buy at the worst times. The specific biases most relevant to the current environment are these. Loss aversion, the human tendency to feel losses approximately twice as intensely as equivalent gains, causes investors to sell falling assets at precisely the moment when their expected future return is highest. When an airline stock has fallen 20% from pre-conflict levels, the psychological pain of holding it drives selling at exactly the moment when the discounted future recovery represents the best risk-adjusted expected return. The investor who sells locks in the loss and misses the recovery. The investor who either holds through the volatility or adds to the position at the depressed price participates fully in the eventual recovery. Recency bias, the tendency to extrapolate recent trends into the future regardless of the underlying analytical picture, causes investors to assume that whatever is currently happening will continue indefinitely. During a crisis, recency bias causes investors to believe the crisis will never end. During a recovery, it causes investors to believe the recovery will continue forever without interruption. In both cases, it leads to decisions that are precisely opposite to what disciplined analysis would recommend. Narrative fallacy, the tendency to construct simple causal stories that explain complex events in ways that feel satisfying, but that miss important nuance, causes investors to overconcentrate on the most dramatic and emotionally salient aspects of a situation rather than on the most analytically important ones. The missiles and the flames and the killed leaders are emotionally salient. The tanker traffic data, the insurance premium movements, the Federal Reserve language, the true leading indicators of market direction, are not emotionally salient but are analytically far more important. The antidote to these biases is not the suppression of emotion. That is neither possible nor desirable. Emotion is information. The antidote is structure. Having a pre-committed analytical framework, precisely the decision tree we built in the previous section, that specifies in advance what actions you will take when specific signals occur, removes the psychological burden of making decisions in the heat of emotional moments. When you have decided in advance that you will reduce airline exposure if oil crosses $120, you do not need to agonize over whether to sell when that signal arrives. The decision is already made. You execute it. The investors who build the best frameworks in advance, who execute those frameworks with discipline when the triggering conditions arrive, and who maintain the psychological stability to wait patiently between signal events rather than reacting to every daily headline. These investors will generate the best long-term returns through this crisis. And the gap between their performance and the performance of investors who react emotionally and without framework will be enormous. Section 10, The World on the Other Side. Structural changes that create decade-long opportunity. Let me close the analytical portion of this episode with the view from the other side. Not the crisis as it is today, but the world as it will have been reshaped when this crisis eventually resolves. Because understanding that world, the world that this conflict is building even as it disrupts, is the foundation for the most important and the most profitable long-term investment decisions. The world on the other side of this conflict will have several defining characteristics that are already being determined by the dynamics of the conflict itself. It will be a world of higher baseline energy prices. Not necessarily as high as today, the fear premium will resolve when the conflict does, but meaningfully higher than the pre-conflict baseline, because the conflict will have demonstrated to every government and every energy consumer that dependence on Middle Eastern oil at any price is a strategic vulnerability. The energy security premium, the additional cost that consumers and governments will accept to have more secure, more domestic, more diverse energy supply, will be permanently higher. This structural demand for energy security supports both domestic fossil fuel production in non-conflicted regions and the entire energy transition investment thesis simultaneously. It will be a world of higher baseline defense spending. Every government that observed this conflict will have conducted its own assessment of whether it has adequate defense capabilities. Most will conclude that it does not. The procurement cycle that this conclusion triggers will sustain defense industry revenues for a decade. The specific capabilities most in demand, air defense, precision munitions, drone systems, cyber capabilities, will see the strongest sustained procurement growth. It will be a world of more regionalized supply chains. The lesson that global supply chains optimized for cost efficiency are strategic vulnerabilities has been taught again by this conflict, reinforcing lessons already learned from the pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The investment in domestic manufacturing, allied nation sourcing, and supply chain resilience that this third lesson triggers is additive to what was already underway. Industrial infrastructure companies, domestic manufacturers, and logistics technology firms operating in resilience-focused supply chains will benefit. It will be a world of accelerated energy transition. The conflict has made the economic and strategic case for reducing oil dependence more concrete and more politically compelling than any climate argument alone has managed to do. The investment in solar, wind, nuclear, battery storage, and grid infrastructure will accelerate. The policy support for that investment, subsidies, tax incentives, regulatory facilitation, will be more durable because it is supported by national security arguments that are immune to the political cycles that affect purely climate-motivated policy. It will be a world of gradually evolving reserve currency architecture. The petrodollar system will persist, but with reduced exclusivity. Gold will play a larger role in official reserves globally. Alternative payment systems will gain marginally more depth and usage. The dollar's structural demand will be somewhat reduced relative to what it would have been without this conflict's accelerant effect on reserve diversification. And it will be a world in which the geopolitical risk premium is structurally higher than it was in the post-Cold War globalization era. The assumption that geopolitical shocks are rare, temporary, and ultimately absorbed without major economic consequence. An assumption that supported the very low risk premiums and the very high equity valuations of the 2010s is no longer tenable. Investors will demand, and markets will price, a higher structural risk premium for holding equity over safety assets. That higher structural premium means lower structural valuations relative to earnings. It means a more challenging long-term environment for multiple expansion. And it means that the return to equity investment will be driven more by earnings growth and less by valuation re-rating than in the previous era. Understanding this structural change in the valuation environment is essential for setting realistic return expectations and for building a portfolio strategy appropriate to the world that is actually coming, rather than the world that existed before this conflict began. Closing the analytical edge and the patient investor, this has been the most comprehensive episode in the Profit Pulse series on this conflict. We have built the complete economic anatomy of oil price transmission through every sector of the economy. We have mapped the global shipping disruption as a systemic, not just individual choke point problem. We have traced the petrodollar system's gradual structural challenge and its decade-long investment implications. We have built the complete defense spending supercycle thesis with the specific subsectors, companies, and capability types that the current procurement cycle prioritizes. We have analyzed the Federal Reserve's trilemma with the historical context of stagflation episodes and their investment implications. We have explained the geopolitical risk premium and why its current elevation creates both near-term pain and long-term opportunity. We have mapped the complete energy independence investment opportunity across 4 specific subthemes with named vehicles and deployment frameworks. We have built the 5-signal decision tree that gives you a complete operational framework for every market scenario. We have addressed the psychological discipline required to invest through a crisis without making behavior-driven errors. And we have described the world on the other side of this conflict, the structural changes that create the decade-long investment opportunities that the crisis is building even as it destroys. That is a complete body of work, the most complete that this channel has produced. What does it all add up to? Let me give you the synthesis in the simplest possible terms. This conflict is a genuine economic crisis of significant and underestimated duration and severity. Its inflationary impact will unfold over 12 to 18 months, not weeks. Its supply chain disruption will take longer to resolve than markets currently price. Its structural consequences for the energy system, the defense industry, the supply chain architecture, and the global financial system will shape the investment landscape for a decade. The correct portfolio response is not panic. It is not complacency. It is structured, disciplined positioning for the environment that actually exists, with meaningful exposure to the sectors that benefit structurally, adequate defensive hedging against the downside scenarios, and preserved liquidity to participate in the positive catalysts when they arrive. The investors who succeed most brilliantly through this period will not be those with the most courage or the most fear. They will be those with the most clarity, the most organized analytical framework, the most disciplined execution of pre-committed decisions when specific signals arrive. You now have that framework. You have the anatomy of the economic transmission. You have the decision tree. You have the structural investment themes. You have the psychological tools to maintain discipline. Use them, build on them, update them as new information arrives. This has been Profit Pulse. Stay informed, stay analytical, stay positioned for the world that is actually coming.